Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. If you have found your way here tonight, you are probably ready to set the day down. Whatever it carried, the noise, the decisions, the things left unfinished, none of it needs to follow you into the next few hours. This is a space built for exactly this moment, the hour when the mind is tired enough to let go, but still awake enough to want something worth listening to. So settle in, adjust your pillow, pull the covers a little closer, let your breathing slow. There is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do. Tonight belongs to the history and to you. And tonight's history is worth staying awake for, at least for a little while longer. In the year 1492, one kingdom did three things that changed the world, and it did all three of them before the year was out. In January, the last Islamic city in Western Europe surrendered its keys. In March, a royal decree forced one of the largest Jewish communities on the continent into exile. And in August, 3 ships left a small Spanish port and sailed west into an ocean that no European had ever crossed with a plan to keep going. 3 decisions. 1 crown. 1 year. None of the people who made those choices fully understood what they had started, but what they started would eventually reach across 4 continents, last 4 centuries, and leave a mark on the modern world that has never fully faded. That is the story we are telling tonight. If this kind of history is what you come here for, the kindest thing you can do for this channel is leave a like before you drift off. Share the episode with someone who would love falling asleep to this, and subscribe so the next one finds you without you having to go looking. And if you want to go a step further and support what we build here, the Patreon link is sitting in the description. Every bit of support makes the next episode possible. Now, back to 1492. Back to a peninsula that had spent 7 centuries at war with itself, a pair of monarchs who had spent their entire lives consolidating power, and a continent that was about to discover it had a very large neighbor it had never met. The Spanish Empire did not appear fully formed. It was built piece by piece, decision by decision, out of ambition and faith and violence and extraordinary luck. Tonight, we follow it from the very beginning. Let the history begin. Chapter 1. The 2 Crowns. The year 1469 did not announce itself as a turning point. It arrived quietly in the middle of a dynastic mess that had been grinding through the Iberian Peninsula for decades, with rival claimants, exhausted nobles, and kingdoms that barely trusted each other. But in October of that year, a 17-year-old princess from Castile married an 18-year-old prince from Aragon, and the shape of the modern world quietly began to shift. Isabella of Castile had not come to that marriage easily. She was the half-sister of a weak and contested king, Henry IV, whose court had spent years arguing about whether his daughter Juana was even legitimate. Isabella had navigated that court with a precision that belied her age, building alliances carefully, never overplaying her hand. When Henry died in 1474, she moved fast. She had herself proclaimed Queen of Castile before her opponents could organize a credible alternative. Ferdinand was not simply a husband she had been assigned. She chose him with political calculation as clear as any treaty. He was heir to Aragon, which controlled not just the northeastern corner of Iberia, but also Sardinia, Sicily, and the trading networks of the western Mediterranean. The marriage contract they signed was unusually specific. Isabella retained sovereign authority over Castile, Ferdinand over Aragon, and neither crown would be absorbed into the other. That distinction mattered enormously. Spain, in the modern sense of a unified nation, did not yet exist. What existed were two separate kingdoms with separate laws, separate currencies, separate cortes, and populations that spoke different languages and carried different historical memories. Ferdinand and Isabella ruled jointly, but they ruled two things, not one. The union was dynastic, not administrative. Still, governing together required governing in the same direction. One of their first shared projects was bringing the great noble houses of Castile to heel. The years before Isabella's accession had been ones of baronial chaos, lords building private armies, extorting towns, ignoring royal authority whenever it was inconvenient. She reasserted crown power through the Hermandad, a kind of royally sanctioned militia that operated across Castile, enforcing order and making it clear that the days of unchecked aristocratic freelancing were ending. Ferdinand brought a similar energy to Aragon's chronic internal disputes, though Aragon's nobility had deeper legal protections and resisted more stubbornly. The two monarchs learned early that unified foreign policy was easier to project than unified domestic administration. What they could agree on, they pursued together with considerable force. What required navigating their separate legal systems, they handled more carefully and more slowly. The church was central to everything they did. Ferdinand and Isabella were genuinely devout, not merely performatively so, and they saw the Catholic faith as the ideological spine of the realm they were trying to build. In 1478, they received papal authorization to establish the Spanish Inquisition, an institution under royal rather than purely ecclesiastical control, designed initially to investigate conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity suspected of secretly maintaining their old faith. It would become something much larger and more durable than its founders may have intended. Granada was the other great unfinished business. The southern third of the Iberian Peninsula had been under Moorish rule since the 8th century, the last remnant of the Islamic world that had once stretched from the Pyrenees to the Euphrates. Ferdinand and Isabella launched a sustained military campaign against the Nasrid Sultanate in 1482. The war lasted a decade, grinding through fortified towns in the mountains and valleys of Andalusia, costly in lives and treasure, consuming the attention and resources of both crowns. The campaign was not simply a military operation. It carried the full weight of crusading ideology. The monarchs framed it as the completion of a centuries-long Christian project to reclaim the peninsula, and that framing mattered for how they raised troops, justified taxation, and projected their authority to the rest of Catholic Europe. Pope Innocent VIII gave the war his formal blessing and the title of Catholic monarchs to Ferdinand and Isabella, a designation that would stick permanently to the Spanish crown. On January 2, 1492, Muhammad III, known to the Spanish as Boabdil, surrendered the keys of Granada. He rode out of the Alhambra and handed over the last Islamic city in Western Europe without a final battle, after a negotiated capitulation that promised protections for the Muslim population remaining behind. Those protections would not last. Within a decade, mass forced conversions and the burning of Arabic manuscripts would replace the terms Granada had been promised. 3 months after Granada fell, Ferdinand and Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree. It ordered the expulsion of all Jews who refused baptism from the territories of the Spanish crown. The community targeted was not a small one. Estimates range widely, but somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people were forced to choose between conversion and exile. Many left for the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and the Netherlands, carrying with them skills in finance, medicine, and trade that Spain would spend generations missing. The expulsion has been read in many ways. Some historians emphasize the theological logic. A unified Christian kingdom could not tolerate a community whose presence, the Inquisition argued, corrupted the faith of conversos by keeping an alternative open. Others point to the practical opportunities it created, since expellees had to leave property and debts behind on short notice. Whatever the weight of each motive, the decree revealed something about how the Catholic monarchs understood unity. It required not just political centralization, but religious homogeneity, enforced if necessary by exile. August 1492 brought the third event of that extraordinary year. Christopher Columbus, a Genoese sailor who had spent years trying to sell a westward Atlantic route to Asia, finally sailed from Palos de la Frontera with 3 ships and around 90 men. The monarchs had initially declined his proposal. A royal commission found the geographical assumptions dubious. Their reversal came late and somewhat reluctantly, pushed in part by the fall of Granada freeing up political attention, and in part by Isabella's willingness to gamble. Columbus himself is not easy to reduce to a single character. He was persistent to the point of obsession, a skilled navigator who nonetheless miscalculated the size of the earth by a significant margin, and a man whose administrative judgment in the Caribbean would prove far worse than his seamanship. But in August 1492, none of that was apparent. He sailed west with a theory, a commission, and very little margin for error. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 drew a line down the Atlantic. Everything to the west belonged to Spain, everything to the east to Portugal. It was negotiated between 2 powers who were still guessing at the shape of what they had found. Brazil, which bends eastward into the Portuguese zone, would eventually reveal just how imprecise the whole arrangement had been. But the treaty established the principle that European crowns could divide the non-European world between themselves, a principle that would govern colonial competition for the next 2 centuries. What Ferdinand and Isabella had built by the mid-1490s was a kingdom more powerful, more unified, and more ideologically coherent than anything the Iberian Peninsula had seen before. It was still 2 crowns, not 1 state. It still had deep internal fractures, regional, linguistic, economic. But the architecture of something new was visible, a monarchy with continental ambitions, a militant Catholic identity, and now an ocean to its west that no one yet fully understood. The work of turning that structure into an empire would fall to the generation that came after them. Chapter 2: Columbus and the Atlantic Wager. Christopher Columbus had been trying to get someone to fund him for years before Spain said yes. He had approached the Portuguese crown first in 1485, and their maritime experts rejected him, not because they thought the Atlantic was uncrossable, but because they calculated correctly that Columbus had badly underestimated how far Asia actually was. He revised nothing. He simply moved on to the next potential patron. Spain was not his first choice, and he was not Spain's first instinct. Columbus presented his proposal to a royal commission appointed by Ferdinand and Isabella sometime around 1486, and they spent the better part of 2 years examining it before returning a verdict that was largely skeptical. The commission's concerns echoed the Portuguese objections. The ocean was probably wider than Columbus claimed, and the ships he was proposing to take could not carry enough supplies to survive a journey of that length if his geography was wrong. They were right. His geography was wrong. What kept the proposal alive was not the strength of his argument. It was persistence, court access, and a small number of influential advocates who believed the gamble was worth taking regardless of the precise calculations. Luis de Santangel, a financial official in the Aragonese court, made the case directly to Isabella in early 1492, and she authorized the expedition shortly after the fall of Granada. The timing was not coincidental. With the Reconquista complete, the crown had both the political bandwidth and a newly sharpened appetite for the next large undertaking. The terms Columbus negotiated before he sailed were remarkable. He demanded hereditary titles, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor-General of any lands he discovered, along with 10% of all revenues derived from those territories. The monarchs agreed. In retrospect, the contract reads as the terms of a man who expected to be dealing with the edges of Asia and who wanted to make sure he was rewarded accordingly when he arrived. He sailed from Palos de la Frontera on August 3, 1492, with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and a crew of roughly 90 men assembled from the surrounding ports. The Santa Maria was the largest vessel, a type called a carrack, heavy and relatively slow. The Niña and the Pinta were caravels, smaller and more maneuverable, better suited to exploratory sailing in unfamiliar waters. None of the 3 was designed for what they were actually about to do. The fleet stopped first at the Canary Islands to resupply and make repairs, departing again on September 6. From the Canaries westward, Columbus followed the trade winds at roughly 28 degrees north latitude, a choice that turned out to be nearly perfect, though he arrived at it through instinct and observation rather than any formal theory of Atlantic wind patterns. The crossing took 33 days. By early October, the crew's anxiety had turned into something closer to open pressure, and Columbus was adjusting his recorded distances to obscure just how far they had traveled without finding land. Land appeared on October 12. A lookout on the Pinta named Rodrigo de Triana spotted it first, in the early hours before dawn. Columbus would later claim the sighting for himself, which entitled him to a promised lifetime pension from the crown, and the question of who truly saw land first became one of the small bitter disputes that followed him for the rest of his life. The island they reached was in the Bahamas. Columbus called it San Salvador. The people he encountered there were Taino, part of a broader Arakan-speaking population spread across the Caribbean islands. Columbus described them in his journal as gentle, generous, and, almost immediately, as suitable candidates for servitude. That pairing admiration and possession in the same breath was characteristic of how he processed everything he encountered in the Caribbean as material to be assessed for its value to Spain. He noted their gold ornaments at once and spent much of his first weeks in the islands asking, through signs and misunderstanding, where the gold came from. He moved through the Bahamas and then south to Cuba, which he initially believed might be a peninsula of mainland China. The logic was not entirely irrational. He was operating with a mental map derived from Marco Polo's descriptions and a wildly compressed estimate of the Earth's circumference. Cuba was large enough, and its coastline complex enough, that he could read what he wanted into it. He sent an embassy inland carrying letters addressed to the Great Khan. Hispaniola was the island that mattered most on that first voyage. Columbus found gold there in quantities that seemed to confirm everything he had been claiming, and the indigenous Taino population was large enough to represent, in his mind, both a labor force and a missionary opportunity. When the Santa Maria ran aground on the northern coast on Christmas Eve 1492, he used her timber to construct a small fort he called La Navidad, the first European structure built in the Americas since the Norse settlements in Newfoundland nearly 5 centuries earlier. He left 39 men at La Navidad and turned back east toward Spain. The return voyage was genuinely dangerous. The North Atlantic in winter does not forgive navigational errors, and Columbus encountered severe storms that separated the 2 remaining ships and very nearly sank both of them. He made landfall in the Azores in mid-February 1493, then continued to Lisbon, where he had an audience with the Portuguese king, before finally reaching Palos on March 15, 7 months and 12 days after he had left. The letter he sent ahead of himself, addressed to Santangel, was printed and circulated across Europe within weeks. It described the islands, the people, the gold, and the possibilities in language calibrated to produce maximum excitement. The letter went through multiple editions in multiple languages before the year was out. Whatever Columbus had actually found, Europe's educated class now knew that something significant had happened in the Atlantic and that Spain had gotten there first. Portugal's reaction was swift and pointed. The 2 Iberian powers had been competing over Atlantic routes and African coastlines for decades, and the Portuguese crown immediately raised the question of which discoveries fell under existing treaties. The 1479 Treaty of Alcasovas had divided Atlantic territories between them, and Portugal argued Columbus's islands might fall within their zone. Ferdinand and Isabella turned to Pope Alexander VI, himself a Spaniard, who issued a series of papal bulls in 1493, drawing a line 100 leagues west of the Azores and granting Spain everything beyond it. Portugal found this arrangement unsatisfactory, and the 2 crowns negotiated directly the following year. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in June 1494, moved the line significantly westward to 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, giving Portugal a larger slice of the Atlantic and, though neither party knew it yet, the eastern bulge of South America that would become Brazil. The line was drawn across a largely unknown ocean by people making their best guesses about what lay on either side of it. Columbus made 3 more voyages. The second, in 1493, brought 17 ships and somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 men, a colonizing expedition, not an exploratory one. He returned to find La Navidad destroyed and every man he had left there dead, apparently killed after conflicts with the Taino. He founded a new settlement, Isabela, on Hispaniola's northern coast, and began the project of extracting gold through organized indigenous labor. The gap between the paradise he had advertised and the reality of governing a struggling colonial settlement began to open immediately. His third voyage in 1498 brought him to the South American mainland for the first time, specifically to the coast of what is now Venezuela, where the volume of fresh water pouring from the Orinoco Delta told him he was looking at something too large to be an island. He wrote in his journal that he believed he had found the outer edges of the Garden of Eden. The theological reading was sincere, not performative. Columbus genuinely struggled to fit what he was seeing into the geographical and scriptural frameworks he had carried across the ocean. By the time of his fourth voyage in 1502, Columbus was sailing under a cloud. He had been arrested on Hispaniola in 1500 by a royal investigator sent to examine complaints about his administration, returned to Spain in chains, and stripped of his governorship. Ferdinand and Isabella restored his titles, but not his authority to govern. He spent his final voyage probing the Central American coastline, looking for a passage to the Indian Ocean, still convinced that Asia was close. He found no passage. He died in 1506, modestly wealthy by most accounts, but far short of the rewards he believed the contract of 1492 had promised him. What Columbus had found was not Asia, and he never fully accepted that. The task of naming what it actually was fell to others, most famously to the Florentine navigator Amerigo Vespucci, whose published accounts of South American coastlines made clear, with enough geographical reasoning to be persuasive, that this was a continent previously unknown to European cartography. A German mapmaker named Waldsee Müller put Amerigo's first name on the new landmass in 1507. The name held, and Columbus's own name attached instead to the sea and the straits and the institutions that bore it, but not to the continents whose existence he had stumbled into without ever quite understanding what he had done. Chapter 3: The Conquistadors. The men who conquered the Americas were not soldiers dispatched by a careful government with a plan. They were entrepreneurs of violence, privately funded, operating under royal licenses called capitulaciones that granted them authority to conquer and govern in exchange for a share of whatever they took. The crown got a fifth of all plunder, the famous quinto real, and the conquistador got the rest, along with whatever titles he could negotiate before he sailed. It was conquest run as a franchise. Hernan Cortés was 33 years old when he left Cuba for the Mexican mainland in February 1519. He had spent 15 years in the Caribbean, first in Hispaniola and then in Cuba, accumulating land and indigenous laborers, but never quite achieving the status he believed he deserved. The expedition to Mexico was his bid for something larger. Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, had authorized the mission and then revoked the authorization, but Cortés sailed anyway, putting himself outside legal sanction before he had even landed. He brought roughly 500 men, 16 horses, and a small number of artillery pieces. On paper, the force was absurdly inadequate for what lay ahead. The Aztec Empire, formerly the Triple Alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, controlled central Mexico and extracted tribute from millions of people across a territory larger than Spain itself. Cortés knew almost none of this when he landed on the Gulf Coast in April 1519. What he learned fast. Two figures proved decisive in the early weeks. One was a Spanish survivor of a shipwreck named Jerónimo de Aguilar, who had lived among the Maya for 8 years and learned their language. The other was a Nahua-speaking woman the Spanish called La Malinche. Her indigenous name was Malintzin, given to Cortés as part of a tribute of enslaved women by a coastal people called the Tabascans. Between them, Aguilar translating from Spanish to Maya and Malintzin from Maya to Nahuatl, Cortés could communicate with the Aztec world. That communication was a weapon. What Cortés discovered through those conversations was that the Aztec Empire had enemies. The tribute system that funded Tenochtitlan's extraordinary wealth and monuments also generated deep resentment among the peoples it taxed, and the practice of taking captives from subject populations for ritual sacrifice had made the empire feared in ways that stopped well short of loyalty. The Tlaxcalans, a people who had resisted Aztec conquest and maintained a surrounded independence, fought the Spanish first and then, after several sharp engagements, decided that an alliance against Tenochtitlan was a more attractive option than continued resistance. The Tlaxcalan alliance was not a minor logistical detail. It fundamentally transformed what Cortés was capable of doing. By the time he marched on Tenochtitlan in the autumn of 1519, he had several thousand Tlaxcalan warriors alongside his few hundred Spaniards, with more allied forces joining as word spread that the empire's enemies were moving. The Spanish provided steel weapons, firearms, horses, and tactical coordination. The indigenous allies provided numbers, local knowledge, supply lines, and the political legitimacy of a coalition rather than an invasion. Tenochtitlan was built on an island in Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways, and it was one of the largest cities in the world at the time Cortés first saw it. He described it in letters to Charles I with undisguised astonishment. The markets, the temples, the canals, the sheer scale of organization required to feed and supply a city of perhaps 200,000 people in the middle of a lake. Moctezuma Sicat, the Aztec ruler, received Cortés and his army peacefully in November 1519, a decision that has been debated ever since. Whether Moctezuma believed Cortés might be the returning god Quetzalcoatl, or whether he was buying time, or whether he calculated that hospitality was safer than open conflict given the alliances already forming around him, is not something the surviving sources resolve cleanly. What happened next is clearer. Cortés took Moctezuma into custody within weeks of arriving, effectively holding the ruler hostage inside his own palace, while the Spanish occupied the city as guests who did not intend to leave. The arrangement collapsed in the summer of 1520. Cortés had briefly left Tenochtitlan to deal with a Spanish force sent from Cuba to arrest him, and during his absence, his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado ordered a massacre of Aztec nobles gathered for a religious ceremony. The reasons remain disputed, but the consequences were not. The city rose against the Spanish garrison. When Cortés returned and found the situation beyond recovery, the Spanish and their allies attempted a nighttime retreat across the causeways on June 30, 1520, a disaster the Spanish called La Noche Triste, the sad night, in which hundreds of Spanish soldiers and thousands of Tlaxcalan allies died. Cortés regrouped. He did not retreat to Cuba, did not abandon the enterprise, did not concede that the situation was unrecoverable. Instead, he spent the following months rebuilding his alliance network, soliciting more indigenous support, and constructing a fleet of small armed vessels, brigantines, that could be carried overland in pieces and assembled on the lakeshore to control the water around Tenochtitlan. It was an extraordinary feat of logistics for an army operating far from any resupply. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in May 1521 and lasted nearly 3 months. By then, smallpox had already done enormous damage inside the city. Moctezuma's successor, Cuitlahuac, had died of it, and the new ruler, Cuauhtémoc, was directing the defense of a population that was dying of disease faster than it was dying in combat. The brigantines cut the causeways and starved the city of resupply. The Allied forces tightened the perimeter block by block, meeting fierce resistance every step of the way. Tenochtitlan fell on August 13, 1521. Cuauhtémoc was captured attempting to flee by canoe across the lake. The city that Cortés had described with such astonishment 18 months earlier was largely rubble. The siege had been destructive in ways that even the victors found difficult to account for cleanly. On its ruins, Cortés would begin building Mexico City, the capital of New Spain, laying the cathedral and the government palace directly over the foundations of the Aztec ceremonial center. Francisco Pizarro's conquest of Peru followed a different timeline, but rhymed in its essential structure. Pizarro was older than Cortés, illiterate, and had spent decades in Panama without achieving much beyond physical survival in difficult country. He made 2 failed attempts to reach the wealthy civilization rumored to exist along the South American Pacific coast before his 3rd expedition, launched in 1531, finally reached the Inca Empire with a force of about 180 men and 37 horses. His timing was extraordinary, though he could not have planned it. The Inca Empire in 1532 was emerging from a devastating civil war between 2 brothers, Huáscar, who had held the traditional capital at Cusco, and Atahualpa, who had built his power base in the northern city of Quito. Atahualpa had won. He had Huáscar captured and was in the process of consolidating control when Pizarro's small force appeared on the northern coast and sent word requesting a meeting. The encounter at Cajamarca on November 16, 1532, is one of the most analyzed moments in the history of conquest. Atahualpa arrived with his court and an escort of several thousand attendants, lightly armed since the meeting had been framed as a diplomatic reception. Pizarro had hidden his cavalry and infantry in the buildings surrounding the central plaza. A Spanish friar named Valverde approached Atahualpa and offered him a Bible or a breviary, presenting it as the Word of God and demanding submission to the Spanish crown and the Christian faith. Atahualpa, who had never seen a book, examined it, heard no voice from it, and dropped it on the ground. Pizarro gave the signal. The artillery fired, the cavalry charged out of concealment, and Spanish infantry cut through the attendants surrounding Atahualpa. The slaughter was severe and the panic total. Thousands of unarmed or lightly armed men in a confined space with no warning and no exit. Atahualpa was captured alive. He was not killed immediately. He was held for 8 months while the Spanish extracted the famous ransom, a room filled once with gold and twice with silver, the largest ransom payment in recorded history up to that point, and then strangled anyway in July 1533 after a rushed trial on charges that included idolatry and the murder of his brother Huáscar. With Atahualpa dead and the ransom absorbed, Pizarro moved on Cusco. The city fell in November 1533. The political structure of the Inca Empire, built around a divine ruler whose authority radiated outward through an elaborate system of roads, administrators, and tribute obligations, had no resilience once that center was gone. Pizarro installed a compliant Inca nobleman named Manco Inca as a puppet ruler, and for a few years the arrangement held well enough to give the Spanish time to dig in. Manco eventually led a massive uprising in 1536, nearly retaking Cusco and besieging Lima, but the rebellion collapsed without achieving its objectives, and the last independent Inca resistance ended with the execution of Tupac Amaru in 1572. The pattern that emerges from both conquests is not simply the story of European technology defeating indigenous resistance. Steel and horses and firearms mattered, but they do not explain how a few hundred men held together under pressure that would have broken most forces. Indigenous allies mattered more than the Spanish generally admitted. Disease created a demographic catastrophe that preceded and enabled the conquest in ways that no army could have replicated. And both Cortés and Pizarro arrived during moments of political fracture, the Aztec tribute empire resented by its subjects, the Inca state torn by succession war that made alliances possible and central authority fragile. The Spanish did not defeat two empires so much as they inserted themselves into conflicts those empires were already losing. Chapter 4: The Encomienda and the New Laws. Spain had conquered two empires in the space of 15 years, and now it faced a problem that conquest does not solve: governance. The men who had done the fighting expected to be rewarded, and the reward they expected was labor, the right to extract work and tribute from the indigenous populations they had helped defeat. The crown needed those men cooperative, needed the colonies producing revenue, and needed the whole enterprise to carry some theological justification that distinguished Spanish rule from simple robbery. Fitting all three needs into a single system was not going to be clean. The Encomienda was the instrument they reached for. It was not invented for the Americas. The word and the concept had roots in the Reconquista, where the crown had granted Christian settlers the right to collect tribute from Muslim populations in newly conquered territories. In the Caribbean, it was adapted into something new and considerably harsher. A Spanish encomendero received a grant of indigenous people, not of land. Legally, the people were still free subjects of the crown, not slaves, but they owed the encomendero labor and tribute in exchange for his obligation to protect them and provide for their Christian instruction. The distinction between legal freedom and practical slavery was, in the Caribbean, essentially meaningless. The Encomienda on Hispaniola and the other islands operated as forced labor under conditions that killed people at a rate that the Spanish themselves found difficult to ignore. Indigenous men were sent to work the gold placers and agricultural fields under quotas that bore no relationship to what a human body could sustain. Women and children were pressed into domestic service. Communities were broken apart and relocated according to labor needs rather than any human logic. The demographic collapse in the Caribbean was catastrophic and rapid. Hispaniola's Taíno population, estimated at somewhere between several 100,000 and several million people at contact, was functionally destroyed within 50 years. Disease carried the largest share of the killing. Smallpox, influenza, and other European pathogens moved through populations with no prior exposure and killed with an efficiency that no system of labor extraction could match. But the Encomienda's brutality accelerated and deepened the collapse, destroying the social structures and food systems that might otherwise have allowed some recovery. The first sustained voice of opposition came from an unexpected source. Antonio de Montesinos was a Dominican friar who stood in a small church in Santo Domingo in December 1511 and delivered a sermon that made the assembled encomenderos deeply uncomfortable. He told them they were in mortal sin. He told them the indigenous people they were working to death had rational souls, were entitled to the protection of Christian law, and that no baptism, no royal grant, and no papal donation gave Spaniards the right to destroy them. The congregation was furious. Montesinos preached the same sermon the following Sunday to make clear it had not been a mistake. The immediate political effect was limited. The encomenderos complained to the crown. The crown pressured the Dominican order to silence Montesinos, and the Dominicans refused. What the sermon did accomplish was to plant a question, a serious, theologically grounded question about the legitimacy of the whole enterprise that could not be entirely suppressed once it had been publicly asked. It was the opening move in a debate that would run for decades. Bartolomé de las Casas began on the wrong side of that debate. He arrived in Hispaniola in 1502 as a young man, participated in the conquest of Cuba in 1513, and held his own encomienda. The conversion came in 1514 during his preparation for a Pentecost sermon, when he read a passage in the book of Sirach about the offerings of the unjust and concluded, apparently with sudden clarity, that everything he was doing and participating in was a sin. He freed his own indigenous workers, returned his encomienda to the governor of Cuba, and spent the next 5 decades as the most persistent and abrasive critic of Spanish colonial practice in the Americas. Las Casas was not a simple figure, and reducing him to a saint of indigenous rights misses the complexity. He initially proposed importing African enslaved people to replace indigenous labor in the Caribbean, a suggestion he later deeply regretted and retracted, and his accounts of Spanish atrocities, while grounded in real observation, were written to persuade rather than to provide neutral documentation. His most famous work, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, compiled between 1542 and published in 1552, described killings, mutilations, and mass deaths in language designed to produce maximum horror in a European reader. It worked. Charles Afours, who as Holy Roman Emperor was also Charles V, was not indifferent to these arguments. He was a genuinely pious man who took seriously the theological obligations that came with ruling a Christian empire, and the sustained campaign by the Dominicans and by Las Casas put real pressure on the court to do something about the Encomienda system. In 1542, Charles issued the New Laws, a comprehensive set of regulations designed to reform colonial governance and, in their most important provisions, to phase out the Encomienda entirely. The new laws were specific and serious. They prohibited the enslavement of indigenous people under any circumstances. They ended the practice of granting new encomiendas and provided that existing ones would revert to the crown upon the death of the current holder rather than passing to heirs. They established that indigenous people were free vassals of the crown, entitled to legal protection, and created new oversight mechanisms through the audiencias, the colonial courts, to enforce those protections. On paper, they represented a fundamental challenge to the entire labor system on which colonial society had been built. The reaction in the colonies was immediate and violent. In Peru, the Viceroy Blasco Núñez Vela arrived in 1544 to implement the new laws and was met with a revolt led by Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the conqueror. The encomenderos of Peru were not willing to accept the loss of their labor grants, and they had enough armed men and enough unity of purpose to make that refusal militarily credible. Gonzalo Pizarro had Núñez Vela captured and eventually beheaded. He effectively controlled Peru for 2 years, governing it as something approaching an independent state. In New Spain, the reaction stopped short of open rebellion, but was intense enough to alarm the colonial administration. The first viceroy, Antonio de Mendoza, delayed implementing the most controversial provisions and sent urgent reports to Spain, warning that enforcement would destabilize the colony. Encomenderos organized, petitioned, lobbied, and made clear through every available channel that the new laws threatened not just their wealth, but the entire functioning social order of the colonial world as they understood it. Charles backed down, not entirely and not immediately, but in 1545 and 1546, the most contentious provisions of the new laws were suspended or revised. The clause ending inheritance of encomiendas was revoked. Existing holders could pass their grants to their heirs, and in practice new encomiendas continued to be issued despite the nominal prohibition. The broader prohibition on indigenous enslavement held, and the legal status of indigenous people as free vassals of the crown was maintained in principle, but the labor system that the new laws had been designed to dismantle continued operating in modified forms. What replaced the Encomienda was not freedom. The repartimiento system, which emerged across the second half of the 16th century as the Encomienda's formal power faded, required indigenous communities to provide rotating drafts of male workers for Spanish enterprises, mines, farms, construction projects, and public works. The workers were paid, at least nominally. The labor was still compelled. Men were still taken from their communities and directed to work under conditions that frequently killed them, and the communities they left behind still had to meet agricultural obligations that were now short of the hands needed to fulfill them. The great debate that the new laws had crystallized did not end with Charles' retreat. In 1550 and 1551, Charles ordered a formal halt to all new conquests in the Americas, while a council of theologians in Valladolid debated the fundamental question of whether indigenous people could legitimately be conquered at all. Las Casas argued against conquest on any terms. Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, a scholar and humanist, argued that indigenous people were natural slaves in the Aristotelian sense, being suited by nature to be governed by others, and that war against them was justified on grounds of their idolatry and their practice of human sacrifice. Neither side was declared the winner, and the conquests resumed. The Valladolid debate is sometimes described as a moment of unusual moral seriousness in the history of empire, a conquering power stopping to ask whether what it was doing was right. That reading is not entirely wrong. The fact that the debate happened at all, that it involved serious theological argument rather than mere rationalization, and that it produced no clean victory for the pro-conquest position, sets Spanish colonial discourse apart from much of what followed in later European empires. But the debate's practical consequences were limited. The conquests resumed. The labor extraction continued. The indigenous population of the Americas continued to fall. Las Casas lived until 1566, dying at 92 years old, still writing and still petitioning the crown. He never stopped believing that the Spanish presence in the Americas could be made legitimate if it was stripped of violence and exploitation and rebuilt on genuine evangelization and consent. Whether that was ever a real possibility, or whether it was a theological argument that the economic structure of the colonial enterprise made permanently unrealizable, is a question his life spent and never resolved. What his decades of pressure did achieve was a body of law, however imperfectly enforced, that encoded the principle that indigenous people were human beings with rights, a principle that colonial practice routinely violated but could never entirely erase from the record. Chapter 5: Charles V and the Weight of Empire. No ruler in European history inherited quite what Charles inherited. By the time he was 19 years old, he held Castile and Aragon through his mother Juana, the Netherlands, and the Franche-Comté through his father Philip, Naples and Sicily through the Aragonese line, and the Habsburg ancestral lands in Austria through his grandfather Maximilian. Each territory came with its own laws, its own nobility, its own language, and its own set of enemies. None of them had asked to be joined to the others. Charles was born in Ghent in 1500, raised in the Netherlands, and spoke French as his first language. When he arrived in Spain in 1517 to take up his Castilian inheritance, He was a foreigner in every sense that mattered to the Castilian nobility. His manners were Flemish, his advisors were Flemish, and his Spanish was halting enough to be an embarrassment in formal settings. The reception was cool. The Castilian Cortes granted him recognition, but made their displeasure about his foreign entourage clear in terms that bordered on insolent. The election of 1519 made everything more complicated. Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian died in January of that year, and the 7 imperial electors were tasked with choosing his successor. Charles was the leading candidate, but Francis I of France mounted a serious challenge, and the election became an expensive competition in bribery, both candidates funneling enormous sums to the electors through banking houses, with the Fuggers of Augsburg providing the critical financing that put Charles over the line. He was elected Holy Roman Emperor in June 1519, becoming the most powerful monarch in Europe before he had finished establishing himself in Spain. The Castilian response to his imperial election was not celebratory. In 1520, a revolt broke out among the cities of Castile, the Comuneros uprising, led by urban oligarchs and minor nobility who resented the drain of Castilian resources to fund Charles's imperial ambitions, and objected to a king who seemed to regard Spain as a source of money rather than a home. The rebellion was serious enough to control large portions of Castile for nearly a year. It was defeated at the Battle of Villalar in April 1521, its leaders executed, and its political program crushed. But Charles took the lesson. He learned Spanish, spent more time in Castile, and began to treat the kingdom as a genuine base rather than an inheritance to be milked. The Ottoman Empire pressed from the east with a force that could not be wished away. Suleiman the Magnificent had come to power in 1520 and immediately demonstrated that he intended to push Ottoman power as far into Europe as it would go. Belgrade fell in 1521. The Knights of St. John were expelled from Rhodes in 1522. At Mohacs in 1526, the Ottoman army destroyed the Hungarian kingdom in a single afternoon, killing the king and most of the Hungarian nobility in a battle that lasted less than 2 hours. The eastern frontier of Christendom was now a wound that bled continuously, and Charles, as Holy Roman Emperor, was expected to defend it. Defending that frontier while simultaneously managing France was the central military problem of Charles' reign. Francis of France was surrounded on 3 sides by Habsburg territory: Spain to the south, the Netherlands to the north, the Empire to the east, and he spent his reign trying to break that encirclement, allying with the Ottoman Empire when necessary, fighting 4 separate wars against Charles between 1521 and 1544. The Italian peninsula became the primary battlefield, with the Duchy of Milan and the Kingdom of Naples as the prizes both crowns refused to stop contesting. The sack of Rome in May 1527 was the most shocking single event of those Italian wars. A Habsburg army, composed of Spanish veterans, German Landsknecht mercenaries, and Italian irregulars, mutinied over unpaid wages and marched on Rome when their commanders lost control of the situation. Pope Clement XI had been navigating between French and Habsburg interests and had recently shifted toward France, which gave the army's action a political logic even as it exceeded any orders Charles had given. The soldiers sacked the city for weeks with extraordinary brutality, killing thousands, looting churches and palaces, holding cardinals for ransom. Charles was in Spain when it happened. He expressed formal regret while making no serious effort to punish those responsible. The Protestant Reformation added a religious dimension to problems that were already military and dynastic. Martin Luther had posted his theses in 1517, the same year Charles arrived in Spain, and by the early 1520s the movement had spread far enough through the German territories that Charles could not simply suppress it by force without losing the support of Protestant princes whose military cooperation he needed against the Ottomans. At the Diet of Worms in 1521, Charles declared Luther an outlaw, but Luther was already beyond his reach, protected by Frederick the Elector of Saxony, and the declaration changed nothing on the ground. Charles spent the next 3 decades attempting to manage the Protestant problem through a combination of military pressure, theological negotiation, and strategic compromise that satisfied nobody completely. The Schmalkaldic League, a defensive alliance of Protestant princes, formed in 1531 to resist any imperial attempt to enforce religious uniformity by arms. Charles defeated the League militarily at the Battle of Mühlberg in 1547, capturing the Elector of Saxony and the Landgrave of Hesse, the 2 leading Protestant princes. The victory lasted 3 years before a new coalition forced him back to the negotiating table. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 ended the immediate military conflict by establishing the principle of cuius regio, eius religio. The ruler of each territory determined its religion, and subjects who disagreed could emigrate. It was a practical settlement rather than a theological one, and Charles regarded it as a defeat. He had spent his reign defending the unity of Christendom and ended it presiding over its formal division. The principle encoded at Augsburg meant that the empire he had inherited could never be the religiously unified Christian commonwealth he had imagined it to be. The physical demands of ruling this empire were extraordinary. Charles spent his reign in near constant motion, traveling between Spain, the Netherlands, Germany, and Italy, conducting campaigns personally, attending diets and councils, managing correspondence that flowed in from every corner of a territory that stretched from Seville to Vienna and from the Caribbean to the Philippines. He suffered from severe gout that made riding agonizing and walking difficult, and in his later years his jaw, a pronounced Habsburg trait exaggerated in his case to the point of physical impairment, made eating and speaking painful. He carried the empire in a body that was steadily failing him. The Americas were being conquered and settled during his entire reign, and Charles engaged with that process more seriously than his reputation as a European ruler sometimes suggests. The new laws of 1542 came from his court. The Valladolid debate of 1550 was convened by his order. The administrative architecture of the Council of the Indies and the viceroyalty system was built during his reign, creating the framework through which Spain would govern its American territories for the next 2.5 centuries. He was never in the Americas and never close to them geographically, but decisions made in his name shaped them profoundly. The abdication, when it came, was not a single event, but a process spread over 2 years. In October 1555, in Brussels, Charles transferred the Netherlands to his son Philip in a ceremony that those present described as deeply emotional. Charles, by then barely able to stand without support, leaning on the shoulder of William of Orange as he spoke about his years of service and his failures to achieve peace. Spain, Naples, and the American territories followed in January 1556. The empire was divided. The Austrian Habsburg lands and the imperial title passed to his brother Ferdinand, while Philip received the Spanish inheritance. Charles retired to the monastery of Yuste in Extremadura in western Spain in early 1557. He did not become a monk, despite later romanticized accounts of his final years. He brought a household of about 50 people, continued to follow political affairs, exchanged correspondence with Philip, and ate and drank considerably more than his physicians advised given his gout. He died in September 1558 at 58 years old, having spent virtually his entire adult life at war or in transit between wars. What Charles left behind was an empire more extensive than the one he had inherited, but also more strained. The debt accumulated through his wars was crushing. The Spanish crown had declared bankruptcy in 1557, the year after his abdication, when the revenues from the Americas and from Castilian taxation proved insufficient to service the loans taken out to fight France and the Schmalkaldic League simultaneously. The silver of the New World was beginning to flow in earnest, but it flowed through Spain's treasury faster than it accumulated there, into the hands of the Genoese and German bankers who had financed the endless campaigns. Philip II inherited a monarchy with global reach, unmatched military prestige, and a financial structure that was already showing the cracks that would eventually bring it down. The problems were not immediately fatal. Spain in 1556 was still the most powerful state in Europe, still producing conquistadors and missionaries and administrators in sufficient numbers to hold and expand its American territories, still capable of projecting force across the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the Pacific simultaneously. But the gap between what the empire demanded and what any single ruler could manage or any single economy could fund had been visible since Charles's first decade on the throne. The lesson Charles' reign offered, though the monarchs who followed him did not consistently apply it, was that empire generates its own momentum, and that momentum is expensive. Every war produced obligations that required further wars to service. Every territory acquired required garrisons, administrators, and subsidies that had to come from somewhere. The silver arriving from Potosí and the gold from New Spain were already being spent before the ships carrying them reached Seville, assigned against debts contracted years earlier to fight enemies who no longer existed in their original form. Charles had built something extraordinary. He had also demonstrated, through the entire arc of his reign, precisely how difficult it was going to be to keep it. Chapter 6: Silver and the Cerro Rico. In 1545, a Quechua miner named Diego Hualpa was sheltering on a mountainside in what is now Bolivia when he noticed something glinting in the exposed rock near his fire. The mountain was called Potosí. What Hualpa had found was one of the richest silver deposits in the history of the world, a single peak containing enough ore to sustain industrial extraction for 3 centuries and to reshape the global economy in ways that nobody standing on that mountainside in 1545 could have begun to predict. The Cerro Rico, the rich hill, rose to nearly 4,800 meters above sea level in the high Andean plateau, in cold so persistent and air so thin that growing food in the surrounding valleys was difficult, and breathing hard physical labor was genuinely dangerous. None of that slowed the Spanish. Within a decade of Hualpa's discovery, Potosí had become one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere, drawing miners, merchants, priests, administrators, and criminals from across the Spanish colonial world. By the end of the 16th century, its population exceeded 160,000 people, larger than London at the time, larger than Seville, larger than most of the cities of continental Europe. The ore was extracted through a labor system the Spanish adapted from Inca practice and made considerably worse. The mita was an Inca institution, a rotating obligation of labor service owed to the state, used for building roads, temples, and agricultural terraces across the Andean world. The Spanish retained the name and the rotational structure, while redirecting it entirely towards silver extraction. Each year, indigenous communities across a vast catchment area were required to send a quota of men to Potosí to work in the mines for a set period, typically 17 weeks, at wages that did not cover the cost of the candles they needed to see underground. The mines were brutal in ways that defy easy description. Men worked in near total darkness, descending on rope ladders into shafts that went hundreds of feet into the mountain, breathing air thick with silver dust and the fumes of the tallow candles they carried. Rock falls killed without warning. The mercury used in the refining process, a method called amalgamation, introduced in the 1570s by a miner named Bartolomé de Medina, caused neurological damage and slow death through prolonged exposure. Miners called the mountain the mouth that ate men, and the death toll across the colonial period runs into the millions by most serious estimates. Viceroy Francisco de Toledo reorganized the entire system in the 1570s with an administrative thoroughness that maximized silver output and minimized the crown's labor costs. Toledo expanded the Mita's catchment area, standardized the quotas, built the infrastructure of refineries and water reservoirs needed for the amalgamation process at scale, and forcibly resettled dispersed indigenous communities into concentrated reducciones, new planned towns that made census-taking and labor drafting far easier to administer. The resettlements destroyed existing community structures, disrupted agricultural patterns, and concentrated populations in ways that made epidemic disease more lethal. Toledo regarded all of this as efficient administration. The silver that came out of Potosí was minted into coins at the Casa de la Moneda, the royal mint established there in 1572. The coins, the famous pieces of 8, the reales de a ocho, became the closest thing the early modern world had to a universal currency. They circulated from Seville to Amsterdam to Istanbul to Goa to Manila, accepted everywhere because their silver content was reliable and their supply was large enough to lubricate commerce across multiple continents simultaneously. Spanish silver did not stay in Spain. It moved, and it moved fast. Potosí was not the only source. The mines at Zacatecas in New Spain, discovered in 1546, produced silver on a scale that would have been extraordinary in any century that did not contain Potosí for comparison. Other deposits across Mexico and Peru added further volumes. The total outflow of silver from the Americas to Spain between 1500 and 1650 is estimated at roughly 17,000 metric tons, a figure that, translated into its effects on European prices, credit markets, and trade networks, represents one of the most significant transfers of material wealth in recorded history. The Manila galleon connected this silver economy to Asia in a way that neither Ferdinand and Isabella nor Charles V had planned or anticipated. Miguel López de Legazpi established the Spanish presence in the Philippines in 1565, and within a few years the route between Acapulco and Manila had become one of the most lucrative trade lanes in the world. Silver went west from Acapulco across the Pacific. Chinese silk, porcelain, spices, and luxury goods came east to New Spain, and from there overland to Veracruz, then by ship to Seville. The galleons were enormous, heavily armed, and sailed only once or twice a year in each direction, but what they carried made the voyage worth the risk. China was the destination that drove the whole circuit. The Ming dynasty had created an enormous demand for silver by making it the basis of its tax system in the 16th century, which meant that the empire with the largest population in the world needed silver in quantities that its own mines could not supply. Spanish-American silver filled that gap, flowing into China through Manila and through Portuguese Macau in volumes that made Chinese merchants willing to sell almost anything the Spanish wanted. The Manila galleon was not simply a trade route. It was a mechanism by which Andean mountain labor subsidized the Ming dynasty's fiscal architecture. The inflationary consequences of all this silver arriving in Europe were severe and poorly understood by contemporaries. Prices across Europe rose dramatically through the 16th and early 17th centuries, a phenomenon historians later called the Price Revolution, and the flood of American silver was a significant contributing cause, though the relationship between silver supply and price levels was more complicated than a simple equation. Spain felt the effects more acutely than most, partly because the silver flowed through Seville before anywhere else, and partly because the Spanish economy had structural weaknesses that prosperity tended to expose rather than correct. Seville held the legal monopoly on American trade through the Casa de Contratación, the royal trading house established in 1503 to regulate and tax all commerce with the colonies. Every ship sailing to or from the Americas was supposed to pass through Seville, register its cargo, and pay the relevant duties. The system generated significant revenue and equally significant smuggling. The Atlantic trade was too large and too geographically dispersed to be effectively policed from a single Andalusian city, and contraband networks connecting colonial ports directly to foreign merchants operated continuously throughout the period. The Genoese bankers who financed Spanish military operations understood the silver system better than most Spanish officials did. The Crown's practice of anticipating future silver revenues, borrowing against shipments not yet arrived, securing loans against the next fleet's cargo, meant that a significant portion of each year's American silver was already spoken for before it reached Seville. The bankers collected their principal and interest in silver, reinvested portions in Spanish bonds called juros, and generally ensured that the wealth of the Americas circulated through the financial networks of northern Italy and southern Germany more efficiently than it accumulated in Spain itself. The human geography of Potosí at its peak was unlike anything else in the colonial world. The city had over 80 churches, scores of gambling houses, a permanent population of professional gamblers, a substantial community of Basque and Extremaduran merchants who controlled the retail trade, indigenous neighborhoods organized by regional origin, and a floating population of metayos, the conscripted miners, who rotated through on their 17-week assignments and tried to survive long enough to go home. Violence was endemic. The Basques and the Extremadurans fought pitched battles in the streets in the 1620s that killed hundreds of people over the course of several years. The ecological transformation of the region around Potosí was total and largely irreversible. The amalgamation process required mercury, which came primarily from the mines at Huancavelica in Peru, themselves operated through a meter system with its own death toll. It also required enormous quantities of wood for fuel, and the forests of the Andean Plateau were stripped across a radius of hundreds of miles. The mountain streams were diverted into artificial reservoirs to power the ore-crushing mills. The landscape that had existed before 1545 was effectively gone within a century of the discovery, replaced by a terrain shaped entirely by the requirements of industrial silver production. By the mid-17th century, Potosí's richest ore bodies were exhausted and the grades were declining. Production fell, the meta quotas became harder to fill as indigenous populations continued shrinking, and the city that had housed 160,000 people contracted steadily. The silver did not stop flowing from the Americas entirely, but the extraordinary volumes of the late 16th century were not sustained. Spain had borrowed against a revenue stream that was finite, spent the proceeds on wars that generated no lasting territorial or economic gains, and now faced the consequences of having treated a geological windfall as a permanent income. The silver of the Cerro Rico bought Spain a century of military primacy in Europe. It funded the armies that fought in the Netherlands, in Italy, against the Ottomans, against the English. It built the fleet that sailed against England in 1588 and the one that replaced it afterward. It paid, partially, never fully, for the bureaucratic machinery that administered an empire spanning 4 continents. What it did not do was build a diversified Spanish economy capable of generating wealth without American mines. The industries that silver purchases should have stimulated at home, textile production, metallurgy, shipbuilding, were often undercut by cheaper imports that Spanish consumers, temporarily enriched by silver, could now afford to buy. The wealth passed through Spain the way water passes through a sieve, and the sieve was not noticeably wetter for the experience. Chapter 7: Philip II and the Peak. Philip II inherited an empire in 1556 that was already the largest and most powerful in the world, and he spent his 42 years on the throne trying to hold it together through sheer administrative willpower. He was not like his father in temperament. Charles had ruled on horseback, moving constantly between territories, personally leading armies, and negotiating face-to-face with rivals. Philip ruled from a desk, reading dispatches, annotating them in his own hand, and sending decisions back across an empire that took months to receive them. That desk was eventually housed inside the most deliberate architectural statement any Spanish monarch ever built. The Escorial, constructed between 1563 and 1584 in the hills northwest of Madrid, was simultaneously a monastery, a royal palace, a mausoleum for the Habsburg dynasty, and a library. Its design was severe almost to the point of austerity. Gray granite, minimal ornamentation, a grid-like plan that reflected the gridiron on which its patron saint, Lawrence, had reportedly been martyred. Philip intended it as a monument to a particular idea of monarchy, one where earthly power served Catholic devotion rather than personal glory. Philip's Catholicism was not simply personal piety. It was the organizing principle of his entire foreign policy, and it shaped nearly every major decision of his reign. He regarded himself as the principal defender of the Catholic faith in Europe, a role that positioned him against Protestant England, against the rebellious Protestant provinces of the Netherlands, and against the Ottoman Empire simultaneously. Few monarchs in history have tried to fight so many enemies on so many fronts while claiming with apparent sincerity that God's favor made the burden bearable. The annexation of Portugal in 1580 gave Philip a claim that no other European monarch could match. King Sebastian of Portugal had died without an heir in 1578, killed in a disastrous campaign in Morocco, and the elderly Cardinal Henry, who succeeded him, died 2 years later, leaving the Portuguese succession genuinely contested. Philip's mother had been a Portuguese princess, which gave him a plausible hereditary claim, and he backed that claim with an invading army under the Duke of Alba that crushed Portuguese resistance within weeks. He was crowned King of Portugal in 1581, and for the first time in history, a single ruler controlled both the Spanish and Portuguese empires. The scale of what this union produced is difficult to overstate. Spain already held the Americas and the Philippines. Portugal held Brazil, the trading posts of West Africa, Goa and the Indian Ocean network, Macau, and the spice routes to the East Indies. For 60 years, until Portugal reasserted its independence in 1640, a single crown theoretically governed territory on every inhabited continent except Antarctica and Australia. The word empire, applied to Philip's Iberian Union, was not hyperbole. The Netherlands, however, refused to be governed. The 17 provinces had been part of the Habsburg inheritance since Charles V's time, prosperous, urbanized, and increasingly Protestant in its northern territories, even as Philip pursued an aggressive program of religious enforcement through the Inquisition and heavy taxation to fund his wars elsewhere. Resentment boiled over in 1566 with the Bealden Storm, a wave of iconoclastic riots in which Calvinist crowds smashed Catholic religious images across dozens of towns. Philip's response was to send the Duke of Alba with an army and a special tribunal that became known as the Council of Blood, executing thousands and confiscating the property of thousands more. The revolt that followed lasted, with intermittent truces, for 80 years. William of Orange emerged as its leader, a Dutch nobleman who had once served Philip's own court and who now organized both military resistance and a remarkably effective propaganda campaign, portraying Spanish rule as tyrannical. The northern provinces formally declared their independence in the Act of Abjuration of 1581, though Spain refused to recognize this for decades and continued fighting to reclaim them. William himself was assassinated in 1584 by a Catholic loyalist acting, he believed, in Philip's service. Philip had placed a bounty on William's head years earlier, an unusual step for a monarch to take against another head of state. England's involvement in the Dutch revolt brought Philip into direct conflict with Elizabeth I, a conflict that had been building for decades through more personal channels as well. Philip had briefly been married to Elizabeth's half-sister, Mary of England, in the 1550s, an arrangement that made him nominally King of England for a few years without ever giving him real authority there. Elizabeth's accession in 1558 and her steady drift toward Protestantism ended any hope of restoring that connection. English privateers, operating with Elizabeth's quiet encouragement, had spent years raiding Spanish shipping and colonial ports, and English support for the Dutch rebels after 1585 made the conflict between the two crowns essentially open, even without a formal declaration of war. Philip decided by the late 1580s that England needed to be dealt with directly. The plan that emerged combined naval and military elements on a scale that had never been attempted. An armada of roughly 130 ships would sail up the English Channel, rendezvous with a Spanish army already stationed in the Netherlands under the Duke of Parma, and escort that army across the narrow strait for an invasion of English soil. It was an intricate plan requiring precise coordination between two forces separated by hundreds of miles and a hostile coastline, and precise coordination was exactly what the plan could not achieve. The Armada sailed from Lisbon in May 1588 under the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a capable administrator with no real naval combat experience, chosen after the death of the fleet's intended commander months earlier. The voyage north was harassed continuously by English ships using faster, more maneuverable vessels and superior long-range gunnery, though the running battles up the channel produced no decisive engagement on their own. The critical failure came at Calais, where the Armada anchored to await word from Parma's army, word that never arrived because Parma's forces were not ready and Dutch rebel ships were blockading the ports his troops needed to embark from. English fire ships sent into the anchored Armada at Calais broke its formation and forced the Spanish ships into open water in disorder. What followed was not primarily a naval defeat in the sense of ships sunk in battle. The losses in direct combat were relatively modest. It was a defeat imposed by geography and weather. The scattered Armada was forced to sail north around Scotland and down the Irish coast to return to Spain, and it was there, in the autumn storms of the North Atlantic, that the fleet was truly destroyed. Perhaps a third of the ships that had sailed from Lisbon never made it home, wrecked on the Irish and Scottish coasts, their crews drowned or killed by English and Irish forces after they washed ashore. The defeat was a genuine shock to Spanish prestige, though its long-term strategic consequences are often overstated in English accounts that treat it as the moment Spanish power began to collapse. Philip rebuilt his navy within a few years, and Spanish fleets continued to dominate the Atlantic silver routes for decades afterward. What the Armada's failure did demonstrate clearly and publicly was that Spain's reach had begun to exceed even its considerable resources, that an empire fighting the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, rebels in the Netherlands, and now England directly, was operating at the outer edge of what any single treasury could sustain. The financial strain was not new to Philip's reign, but it reached a scale under him that his father would have found alarming. Spain declared bankruptcy, technically a suspension of payments to its creditors, in 1557, 1560, 1575, 1596, and would do so again repeatedly in the following century. Each bankruptcy followed the same pattern. Silver revenues from the Americas, already mortgaged years in advance to Genoese and German bankers, proved insufficient to cover the costs of simultaneous wars on multiple fronts. The crown would renegotiate its debts, the bankers would extract harsher terms, and the cycle would begin again with the next military campaign. Philip's personal life was marked by the same relentless duty that characterized his governance. He married 4 times, outliving 3 wives, and fathered the heir who would eventually succeed him, the future Philip III, only late in his reign, after decades of anxiety about the succession. His eldest son from his first marriage, Don Carlos, showed signs of severe mental instability and was imprisoned by Philip's own order in 1568, dying within the year under circumstances that fueled dark rumors across Protestant Europe about a father who had murdered his own son for the good of the state. By the time Philip died in 1598, after a prolonged and agonizing illness during which he insisted on being moved to a room at the Escorial where he could see the high altar of the basilica from his bed, the empire he left behind was the largest the world had yet seen, and also, beneath its surface grandeur, deeply exhausted. The wars in the Netherlands continued without resolution. The English conflict had settled into an uneasy standoff. The Ottoman threat in the Mediterranean had receded somewhat after the Christian naval victory at Lepanto in 1571, one of the genuine triumphs of Philip's reign, but had not disappeared. The silver still flowed from the Americas, but it flowed into a treasury that owed more than it could ever hope to collect. Philip II represents, more clearly than any other Spanish monarch, the paradox at the center of the whole imperial project. He commanded more territory, more revenue, and more military reach than any ruler in Christian history to that point, and he used all of it in the service of a religious and dynastic vision that consumed resources faster than even Potosí's silver could replace them. The peak of Spanish power and the first unmistakable signs of Spanish overextension arrived in the same reign, sometimes in the same decade, occasionally in the very same campaign. What looked from the outside like the summit of Spanish greatness was already, from inside the treasury and the war councils, beginning to resemble something closer to its limit. Chapter 8: The Machinery of the Indies. An empire that stretched from Manila to Madrid could not be governed by improvisation, and the Spanish crown understood this from remarkably early in the conquest. Within a decade of Columbus's first voyage, institutions were already being built to regulate, tax, and administer what was still, at that point, a scattering of Caribbean settlements. By the time those institutions matured across the 16th century, they had produced one of the most elaborate bureaucratic systems the early modern world had ever seen, a structure designed to govern territories that no single official would ever see in their entirety. The Casa de Contratación, founded in Seville in 1503, sat at the commercial heart of the whole system. It licensed every ship sailing to the Indies, registered every passenger, inspected cargo, collected duties, and maintained the master charts, the Padrón Real, that recorded the accumulating geographic knowledge of the Atlantic world. No merchant, no colonist, no cargo of any consequence was supposed to cross the ocean without passing through its oversight. In practice, smuggling and unlicensed trade ran alongside the legal system for the entire life of the empire, but the Casa's authority over the legitimate trade was total. The Council of the Indies, established formally in 1524, exercised a broader authority still. It functioned as the supreme governing body for all American and Philippine affairs, legislative, judicial, and administrative, advising the king directly and issuing the royal decrees, the Cedulus Realis, that constituted colonial law. Its members sat in Spain, thousands of miles from the territories they governed, working from written reports that took months to arrive and answering with instructions that took months more to reach their destination. Colonial governance, by its very structure, was a conversation conducted at the speed of sailing ships. That structural delay shaped everything about how the empire actually functioned on the ground. A viceroy in Lima might receive royal instructions addressing a crisis that had already resolved itself, one way or another, by the time the paperwork arrived. Colonial officials developed a functional response to this gap that became almost a constitutional principle in practice. Obedezco pero no cumplo. I obey but do not comply. An official would formally receive and honor a royal order acknowledging the crown's authority, while quietly declining to implement it if local circumstances made it impractical or dangerous. The fiction preserved royal sovereignty while allowing the empire to actually function. The viceroyalties formed the two great pillars of American administration. New Spain, established in 1535 with its capital at Mexico City, governed territory stretching from California through Central America. Peru, established in 1542 with its capital at Lima, governed the Andean territories and, for much of the colonial period, most of South America south of the Isthmus of Panama. Each viceroy held near royal authority within his jurisdiction. He was the king's direct representative, commanded the colonial militias, presided over the highest colonial court, and controlled ecclesiastical patronage within his territory. Beneath the viceroys sat the audiencias, courts that combined judicial and administrative functions in a way that would look strange to modern eyes trained on a separation of powers. An audiencia heard legal appeals, but it also functioned as a check on viceregal authority, since its judges, the oidores, reported independently to the Council of the Indies, and could, and sometimes did, challenge or override a viceroy's decisions. Multiple audiencias operated within each viceroyalty in cities like Guatemala, Guadalajara, Santa Fe, Quito, and Charcas, extending royal justice into regions the viceroy himself might never personally visit. Local government rested on a layer of officials whose corruption was so consistent that it functioned almost as an unofficial tax. Corregidors administered indigenous towns and districts, responsible for collecting tribute and organizing labor drafts, and the position was widely understood by the crown as much as anyone as an opportunity for personal enrichment that came with the job. Many corregidors purchased their positions, and having paid for the privilege, they extracted whatever profit the position could yield during their limited term, often through forced sales of goods to indigenous communities at inflated prices, a practice called the repartimiento de mercancías. The sale of offices, more broadly, became one of the crown's most reliable sources of colonial revenue, particularly from the early 17th century onward as the treasury's financial troubles deepened. Positions on the audiencias, municipal council seats, notary appointments, even some ecclesiastical posts could be purchased outright, a practice formalized under the term venalidad de cargos. The system generated cash for a chronically indebted crown while systematically undermining the competence and disinterestedness of colonial administration, since men who had bought their offices generally intended to recoup the investment through whatever means the position made available. The church operated as a parallel structure of power running alongside, and sometimes in tension with, the civil administration. Bishops and archbishops held authority that rivaled viceroys in certain domains, particularly over matters of doctrine, marriage, and moral conduct, and the church controlled enormous landholdings, urban property, and capital through its convents, monasteries, and charitable foundations. The Patronato Real, a set of privileges granted to the Spanish crown by the papacy, gave the king authority to appoint bishops and control ecclesiastical revenue within the Indies, meaning that in Spanish America, church and state were never fully separate institutions, but two arms of a single royal project justified in religious terms. The mendicant orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and later the Jesuits, carried out the actual work of evangelization across enormous rural territories that the civil bureaucracy barely touched. A parish priest in a remote Andean or Mesoamerican village often represented the only regular contact between an indigenous community and any institution of Spanish authority. These friars learned indigenous languages. Some compiled the first grammars and dictionaries of Nahuatl, Quechua, and other languages, and their reports back to their orders and to the crown constitute an enormous share of what is known today about indigenous life under colonial rule. Tribute and taxation formed the fiscal backbone that made the entire apparatus worth maintaining from Madrid's perspective. Indigenous communities paid tribute in goods, labor, or coin, assessed through periodic counts of the tributary population that were frequently inaccurate and almost always contested. The quinto real, the royal fifth, claimed a share of all precious metal extraction. The alcabala, a sales tax modeled on a Castilian precedent, applied to commercial transactions throughout the colonies. Layered on top of these were countless smaller levies, each with its own history and its own bureaucratic apparatus for collection. The reducciones, the planned resettlement towns, established most systematically under Viceroy Toledo in Peru during the 1570s, served administrative convenience as much as evangelical purpose. concentrating dispersed indigenous populations into gridded towns built around a central church and plaza on a model imported directly from Iberian town planning, made it dramatically easier to count residents, collect tribute, organize labor drafts, and oversee religious instruction. The human cost of these resettlements was severe. Communities were uprooted from ancestral lands, agricultural cycles were disrupted, and the concentration of population made epidemic disease spread with lethal efficiency. Administrative efficiency and human devastation were in this system frequently the same policy viewed from different angles. The gap between the law written in Madrid and the life lived in Lima or Mexico City was not an occasional failure of the system. It was, in a meaningful sense, the system's actual operating principle. The laws of the Indies, compiled and recompiled across the 16th and 17th centuries into an enormous body of legislation covering everything from indigenous labor to municipal governance to the treatment of enslaved people, represented an aspiration toward just and orderly rule that colonial reality routinely fell short of. Officials on the ground facing local pressures, economic incentives, and physical distances that made close supervision impossible, interpreted, delayed, or simply ignored provisions that Madrid's lawyers had drafted with genuine care. Visitas, formal inspection tours sent periodically from Spain to audit colonial administration, represented the Crown's primary tool for checking this drift, and their findings were consistently alarming to whichever official read them. Inspectors documented corruption among corregidors, abuse of indigenous labor beyond even what colonial law permitted, fraud in the collection of royal revenues, and viceroys who had enriched their own families through the patronage powers of their office. The visitas produced reports. The reports produced reforms on paper, and the reforms produced new generations of officials who learned to operate within and around whatever new rules had been imposed. What held this sprawling, often self-contradicting system together across 3 centuries was not efficiency, and it was not the fear of royal punishment, since punishment for colonial malfeasance was rare and rarely severe. What held it together was a shared understanding among Spaniards throughout the empire, from the Council of the Indies in Madrid to the meanest corregidor in a remote Andean district, that the entire structure existed to extract wealth from American land and American and African labor and deliver a portion of that wealth back to Spain while maintaining enough order, enough Catholic ritual, and enough legal fiction of just governance to make the whole project appear, to itself and to the world, like something more than simple extraction. The Spanish colonial state was, in the end, an extraordinary act of institutional imagination, an attempt to project uniform law, uniform faith, and uniform royal authority across a physical distance and cultural diversity that no early modern government had ever previously attempted to govern as a single coherent unit. It succeeded well enough to last nearly 300 years, which is no small accomplishment by any historical standard. It also generated, at every level of its operation, the corruption, the cruelty, and the quiet institutionalized defiance of its own laws that would eventually convince the American-born subjects of that empire that they could govern themselves rather better than Madrid had ever managed to govern them. Chapter 9: Faith, Inquisition, and the Idea of Empire. The Spanish Inquisition has accumulated so much myth over the centuries that separating the institution from its legend requires real effort. It was established in 1478 by papal bull at the request of Ferdinand and Isabella, and it operated under royal rather than papal control, a distinction that mattered enormously since it made the Inquisition an arm of the Spanish state rather than an independent instrument of Rome. Its original purpose was narrow. It existed to investigate conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity, suspected of secretly practicing Judaism while outwardly conforming to Catholic ritual. The scope of the institution expanded steadily over the following century, moving well beyond its original target population. Moriscos, converted Muslims, came under similar suspicion after the forced conversions that followed the Granada campaign. Protestants, or anyone suspected of Protestant sympathies, became a priority target from the 1520s onward as the Reformation spread across northern Europe. By the later 16th century, the tribunals were also investigating bigamy, blasphemy, sodomy, witchcraft, and a wide range of behaviors that fell under the broad umbrella of moral and religious deviance. The actual mechanics of an Inquisition trial were procedurally distinct from what popular imagination often assumes. Accusations were gathered through edicts of grace, periods when communities were invited to confess their own faults or report their neighbors, which generated an enormous volume of denunciations driven as often by personal grievance as by genuine religious concern. The accused were held in secret, denied knowledge of their accusers, and questioned repeatedly by trained inquisitors who were, by the standards of the period, more methodical and better documented than most secular courts. Torture was used, though considerably less often and under tighter formal restrictions than the secular criminal courts of the same period applied it. Records suggest execution rates lower than popular memory assumes as well. The great majority of cases ended in penances, fines, public humiliation, or reconciliation with the church rather than death. That said, the numbers that were executed, the autos de fe staged as public spectacles in city squares with crowds gathered to watch, and the decades of fear the institution generated across Spanish society represent a real and serious history of state-sponsored religious terror, whatever the precise statistical tallies eventually settled on by modern historians. What the Inquisition achieved most effectively was not the elimination of heresy so much as the production of conformity. Ordinary Spaniards learned to police their own speech, their own reading habits, their own private religious practices, because any deviation might be reported by a neighbor, a servant, or a rival with a grudge. The institution functioned as a mechanism of social discipline as much as theological enforcement, reinforcing a particular vision of Spanish identity in which Catholic orthodoxy and loyalty to the crown were treated as inseparable qualities of a good subject. That fusion of religion and political identity extended directly into how Spain understood its American empire. The papal donations of 1493, followed by the Treaty of Tordesillas the following year, had granted Spain sovereignty over the New World on explicitly religious grounds. The crown's obligation, in exchange for its authority, was to bring the peoples of these territories into the Catholic faith. Conquest and evangelization were, in the official ideology of the empire, the same project viewed from two angles. A conquistador's sword and a friar's cross served, at least in theory, a single purpose. The missionary enterprise that followed the conquest was staggering in its scale and its speed. Franciscans arrived in New Spain within a few years of Tenochtitlan's fall, and by the 1530s they had baptized, by their own reporting, millions of indigenous people across central Mexico. The friars learned Nahuatl and other indigenous languages with real seriousness, compiled grammars and catechisms, and in some documented cases developed genuine respect for aspects of indigenous culture, even as they worked to dismantle its religious foundations entirely. Bernardino de Sahagun's monumental ethnographic project, compiled over decades with indigenous collaborators, preserved an enormous body of Nahua knowledge, even while serving the ultimate goal of more effective conversion. The speed of these mass baptisms troubled some observers even at the time, converting millions of people to a faith whose theology, ritual, and cosmology were entirely foreign to them. In the space of a few years, inevitably produced a Catholicism that blended with existing indigenous belief systems in ways the Church did not always intend or fully control. The cult of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which emerged in Mexico in the 1530s, built around an apparition to an indigenous convert named Juan Diego on a hill previously sacred to the Nahua goddess Tonantzin, exemplifies how thoroughly indigenous and Catholic religious meaning became intertwined rather than one simply replacing the other. The Jesuit reductions in Paraguay represented a distinct and in some ways contrary model of religious colonization. Beginning in the early 17th century, Jesuit missionaries established a network of self-governing mission towns among the Guarani people, deliberately organized to keep the communities isolated from Spanish settlers and the Encomienda system that dominated labor relations elsewhere in the empire. Within these reductions, Guarani communities farmed collectively, produced their own militias for defense, developed printing presses and orchestras that performed European Baroque music, and maintained a level of relative protection from the exploitation that characterized colonial life in most other regions. The reductions were not free of coercion or cultural transformation. Guarani religious and social life was reorganized around Catholic ritual and Jesuit administrative structures in ways that indigenous communities had not chosen for themselves. But compared to the mining mita or the plantation economies elsewhere in Spanish America, the Paraguayan reductions offered a measurably different relationship between colonizer and colonized. That difference generated real hostility from colonial settlers and slave raiders, particularly the Portuguese bandeirantes operating out of São Paulo, who saw the concentrated Guarani populations as a convenient source of captives for the slave trade and repeatedly attacked the mission towns. Underlying all of this missionary activity was a theological question that Spain never fully resolved. Did indigenous peoples possess rational souls? And if they did, what obligations did that impose on the men who claimed authority over them? Pope Paul III addressed this directly in 1537 in the papal bull Sublimis Deus, declaring that indigenous peoples were indeed rational beings capable of receiving the Christian faith and should not be enslaved or deprived of their liberty and property. The declaration carried real theological weight, but enforcing it against the economic interests of encomenderos and mine owners proved, as with so much colonial legislation, a persistent and largely unsuccessful struggle. The Valladolid debate of 1550, discussed in an earlier chapter, represents the fullest formal airing of this question, and its unresolved conclusion tells its own story about the limits of Spanish self-examination. Bartolomé de las Casas argued that indigenous peoples were fully rational, that their societies before conquest had achieved genuine civilizational sophistication, and that Spanish conquest had been conducted through methods no Christian theology could justify. Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda countered that indigenous practices, human sacrifice, cannibalism in some regions, what he characterized as barbarism in social organization, justified conquest as a form of just war, and that indigenous peoples occupied a natural category suited to being governed by their conquerors. Neither position won an official verdict, and Charles V's council ultimately allowed conquest to continue without formally endorsing either theological framework. What the debate demonstrates, more than any conclusion it reached, is that Spain's imperial ideology contained a genuine internal contradiction that its own theologians recognized and argued about with real seriousness. The empire justified itself as a project of salvation, bringing millions of souls to Christianity who would otherwise have been lost to damnation, and simultaneously built its economic foundation on forced labor systems that killed those same souls in numbers that any honest accounting made difficult to reconcile with a rescue mission. The intellectual tradition that grew out of this tension was not without consequence beyond Spain's own borders. Francisco de Vitoria, a Dominican theologian at the University of Salamanca who never set foot in the Americas, developed arguments in the 1530s and 1540s about the natural rights of indigenous peoples, the limits of just war, and the conditions under which one people might legitimately claim authority over another. His lectures, compiled and circulated after his death, are considered by many historians of international law to be foundational texts in the development of the modern concept of international law itself, an irony worth sitting with that some of the earliest rigorous arguments for universal human rights emerged directly from Spanish anxiety about the violence its own empire had committed. By the end of the 16th century, the religious architecture of the Spanish Empire had become largely fixed in the form it would hold for the remainder of the colonial period. The Inquisition continued operating tribunals in Spain and, from 1571 onward, in Lima and Mexico City as well, policing orthodoxy among the growing colonial population. The Church held vast landholdings, ran hospitals, schools, and universities across the Americas, and functioned as perhaps the single most powerful institution in colonial society outside the viceregal government itself. Catholic ritual structured daily life for millions of people across 4 continents in forms that blended European liturgy with local practice in patterns that varied enormously from region to region. What emerges from this history is an empire that took its own religious justifications more seriously, in an intellectual sense, than most colonizing powers before or since, genuinely debating the humanity and rights of the people it conquered, producing serious theological literature, questioning its own legitimacy, and building missionary institutions that occasionally protected indigenous communities from the worst excesses of colonial exploitation. It is also an empire whose religious project cannot be separated from the violence, forced labor, and demographic catastrophe that made its wealth possible. The faith was not a mask laid over conquest to disguise it. It was, for many of the Spaniards who built and defended the empire, entirely sincere, which does not make its consequences for the people on the receiving end of that sincerity any less devastating. Chapter 10: The 17th Century Decline. Philip III came to the throne in 1598 with none of his father's appetite for personal governance. Where Philip II had read every dispatch and annotated every decision himself, his son delegated the actual work of ruling to a favorite, the Duke of Lerma, who accumulated wealth and influence on a scale that scandalized even a court accustomed to aristocratic excess. The pattern this set, a king who reigned without ruling, and a valido who governed in his name while enriching himself and his family, would recur through the rest of the Habsburg century in Spain, with consequences that compounded over time. One of Philip III's most consequential decisions was also one of his cruelest. In 1609, on Lerma's urging, the crown ordered the expulsion of the Moriscos, descendants of Spain's Muslim population who had been forcibly converted to Christianity a century earlier, and who were suspected, not without some basis, of maintaining private loyalty to Islam beneath a surface of Catholic conformity. Roughly 300,000 people were expelled over the following years, concentrated heavily in the eastern regions of Valencia and Aragon, where Morisco agricultural labor had been essential to the regional economy. The expulsion devastated local farming communities and removed a productive population Spain could not easily replace. Philip IV inherited the throne in 1621 as a 16-year-old, and the favorite who took control of his government was a considerably more formidable figure than Lerma had been. Gaspar de Guzman, the Count Duke of Olivares, was intelligent, tireless, and genuinely convinced that Spain's problems could be solved through centralization and reform, if only the political will existed to push it through. He identified correctly that Spain's system, a loose confederation of kingdoms, each with its own laws, taxes, and privileges, could not sustain the military burdens the crown continued to take on. His diagnosis was sound. His remedies proved politically impossible to implement. Olivares's central project, the Union of Arms proposed in 1626, aimed to distribute the empire's military costs more evenly across its constituent kingdoms, rather than leaving Castile to bear the overwhelming share, as had been the pattern for a century. Aragon, Catalonia, Portugal, and the other territories of the crown resisted fiercely, each guarding its traditional exemptions and privileges with the tenacity of communities that had negotiated those terms centuries earlier and had no intention of surrendering them now. Olivares pushed anyway, and the pushing generated exactly the resentment his critics had warned it would. The 30 Years' War, raging across Central Europe from 1618 onward, drew Spain into a commitment that drained resources at a pace even Potosí's silver could not sustain indefinitely. Spain fought as the Austrian Habsburgs' most important ally, funding armies, subsidizing allied princes, and maintaining the long military corridor known as the Spanish Road that connected Habsburg Italy to the Netherlands through Habsburg-friendly territory in between. The war's cost climbed year after year with no end in sight, and by the 1630s it had merged with Spain's older, already exhausting conflict against the Dutch rebels into a single continuous drain on the treasury. Catalonia broke first. In 1640, resentment over billeted troops, wartime taxation, and the perceived disregard for Catalan legal privileges exploded into open revolt, beginning with a peasant uprising in Barcelona that killed the royal viceroy. The Catalans, unable to defend their rebellion alone, appealed to France for support, and Louis XIII's government was glad to weaken a rival by any means available. The war in Catalonia dragged on for over a decade, formally ending only in 1652, after enormous destruction across the region and a French occupation that Catalans found, in the end, no more appealing than Madrid's rule had been. Portugal's revolt, beginning within months of Catalonia's in December 1640, proved far more consequential and permanent. Portuguese nobles, resentful of 60 years of union with Spain that had brought heavy taxation and entanglement in wars serving Castilian rather than Portuguese interests, proclaimed the Duke of Braganza as King John IV. Spain, already fighting in Catalonia and against France and the Dutch simultaneously, could not muster the military force to reconquer Portugal, and the war dragged on inconclusively for nearly 3 decades. Spain finally recognized Portuguese independence in 1668, ending the brief and unhappy Iberian Union Philip II had assembled with such confidence in 1580. Olivares did not survive these disasters politically, blamed, not entirely unfairly, for policies that had provoked simultaneous rebellion in 2 major territories, while the war against France and the Dutch continued without resolution. He was dismissed from office in 1643. He died 2 years later, reportedly having lost his sanity in his final months, a broken figure whose diagnosis of Spain's structural weakness had been essentially correct, even as his attempts to fix it had helped tear the monarchy apart. Few chief ministers in European history have been so right about a problem and so catastrophic in their chosen remedy. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 formally ended the 30 Years' War and, within its terms, finally recognized Dutch independence after 80 years of intermittent fighting that Spain had never managed to bring to a decisive conclusion. The recognition was less a strategic choice than an admission of exhaustion. Spain had spent the better part of a century trying to reclaim 7 rebellious provinces and had succeeded only in bankrupting itself repeatedly, while the Dutch built, in the same period, one of the most formidable trading and naval powers in the world. The war against France continued past Westphalia, grinding on for another 11 years until the Peace of the Pyrenees in 1659 finally ended it. The terms were not generous to Spain. Significant territories along the northern border passed to France, and the treaty was sealed by the marriage of the Spanish Infanta Maria Theresa to the young Louis XIV, a marriage that carried within it a renunciation of her succession rights, a legal provision that France would later argue away when the Spanish succession itself became contested at the end of the century. Beneath these military and diplomatic reversals, the Spanish economy was suffering a deeper structural decline that no single treaty could reverse. Silver production at Potosí had fallen substantially from its late 16th century peak as the richest and most accessible ore bodies were exhausted and deeper extraction became more expensive and more dangerous. Castile's population had declined significantly across the century, hit by plague, by the cumulative losses of decades of war, and by emigration to the Americas that drew away exactly the kind of ambitious younger population a recovering economy needed most. Spanish manufacturing, never robust even during the boom years of American silver, atrophied further as cheaper textiles and manufactured goods from England, France, and the Netherlands flooded into Spanish and colonial markets. The country that controlled the mines producing the world's silver increasingly found itself buying manufactured goods from its rivals with money that passed through its hands almost as quickly as it arrived. Spanish merchants in Seville often functioned as little more than intermediaries, registering foreign goods under Spanish names to satisfy the legal fiction of the trade monopoly, while the actual profits flowed to Amsterdam, London, and Genoa. Charles II, who succeeded his father Philip IV in 1665 at the age of 3, embodied in his own person the accumulated consequences of Habsburg dynastic policy. Generations of marriages between close relatives intended to keep Habsburg territories consolidated within the family had produced a genetic burden that Charles carried visibly and severely. He suffered from significant physical and developmental disabilities, could not walk properly until he was several years past the normal age, struggled with speech, and was widely regarded by contemporaries, with considerable justification, as unfit to govern in any meaningful sense. The reign that followed, stretching from 1665 to 1700, is remembered in Spanish historiography as a period of near total drift. Regents and favorites governed in Charles's name through his minority and well into his adulthood, since his health and capacity never really permitted independent rule. The empire did not collapse during these decades. It retained its American territories, its Philippine outpost, its formal prestige as one of Europe's great crowns, but it exercised almost no initiative on the international stage, reacting to events shaped increasingly by France, England, and the rising power of the Dutch Republic, rather than driving those events itself. The central problem of Charles II's reign, and the one that would determine the fate of the entire Spanish Empire once he was gone, was that he had no children, and given his health, was never likely to produce any. The question of who would inherit the Spanish throne and its vast American territories became the central diplomatic obsession of every major European power through the 1690s, as rival claimants circled a succession that everyone understood was coming and that nobody could resolve without risking a general European war. Charles himself, in his final years, wavered between candidates under pressure from competing factions at his own court, unable to settle the matter with any confidence before his death finally arrived. Charles II died in November 1700, the last Habsburg to sit on the Spanish throne, ending a dynasty that had ruled Spain since Charles V's arrival nearly 200 years earlier. His will named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his successor, a choice that immediately alarmed every power in Europe wary of a union between the French and Spanish crowns. The empire that Ferdinand and Isabella had begun building in 1469, that Charles V had expanded across 2 continents, and that Philip II had brought to its zenith, now stood vast on paper and hollow in its treasury, waiting to see whether a French prince could hold it together, and whether the rest of Europe would let him try. Chapter 11. The Bourbon Arrival. The will Charles II left behind in November 1700 solved one problem by creating a much larger one. Naming Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, as his successor kept the Spanish Empire intact rather than dividing it among competing claimants, which had been one of the diplomatic options seriously discussed in the years leading up to Charles's death. But a Bourbon on the Spanish throne, sitting beside a Bourbon on the French throne, raised the possibility of a combined French-Spanish power that the rest of Europe found intolerable to contemplate. Louis XIV accepted the inheritance on his grandson's behalf almost immediately, and Philip arrived in Madrid in early 1701 to be crowned Philip V of Spain. England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire responded within months by forming the Grand Alliance against France and Spain, determined to prevent what they saw as an unacceptable concentration of Bourbon power in Europe. The War of the Spanish Succession that followed would last 13 years, fought across the Spanish Netherlands, Italy, Germany, and the Iberian Peninsula itself, with the Spanish crown as both prize and battlefield. The war split Spain internally in ways that mattered enormously for how the eventual Bourbon monarchy would govern. Castile largely supported Philip V, but Catalonia, Aragon, and Valencia backed the rival claimant, Archduke Charles of Austria, partly out of genuine preference and partly out of a calculation that an Austrian Habsburg victory would preserve the regional privileges and fueros that these territories had guarded so carefully for centuries. That calculation would prove disastrous once the war concluded, since Philip V never forgot which regions had fought against him. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713, confirmed Philip V on the Spanish throne, but extracted a heavy price in the process. Spain ceded Gibraltar and Minorca to Britain permanently. It surrendered its European territories outside Iberia, the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, and Milan, to Austria and Savoy, ending 2 centuries of Spanish presence in Italy and the Low Countries. Crucially, the treaty also required a formal guarantee that the French and Spanish crowns would never be united under a single monarch, addressing directly the fear that had triggered the war in the first place. Philip V used his victory to settle scores with the territories that had opposed him. Catalonia, whose capital Barcelona held out until September 1714, in one of the most determined sieges of the entire war, paid the steepest price. Philip issued the Nueva Planta decrees between 1707 and 1716, systematically abolishing the traditional legal institutions, the fueros, and the regional cortes of Aragon, Valencia, and Catalonia, replacing them with Castilian law and Castilian administrative structures. Centuries of distinct regional governance ended in the span of a decade, imposed by a king determined that his kingdom would never again fracture along these particular lines. The reforms that followed over the coming decades went well beyond punishing rebellious provinces. Philip V and his advisors, drawing heavily on French administrative models familiar from the Bourbon court in Versailles, worked to build a more centralized, more rationalized Spanish state than the old Habsburg system of overlapping jurisdictions and inherited privileges had ever allowed. Intendants, a French institution imported wholesale, were introduced to oversee regional finance and administration, answering directly to Madrid rather than operating through the tangle of local nobility and inherited office that had characterized Habsburg governance. The military and naval establishment received particular attention, since the losses at Utrecht had exposed just how far Spanish power projection had fallen behind Britain and France. José Patiño, a capable minister who served under Philip V through the 1720s and 1730s, rebuilt the Spanish Navy from a fraction of its former size into a force capable of defending American shipping and contesting European rivals in the Mediterranean. New shipyards, new arsenals, and a more professional officer corps emerged from these efforts, though Spain never fully closed the gap with British naval power for the remainder of the century. Philip V's reign was also marked by a personal instability that periodically paralyzed the government at its highest level. He suffered from what modern historians generally understand as a severe depressive or bipolar condition, with episodes during which he refused to leave his bed, would not attend to state business, and at times abdicated briefly in favor of his son Louis in 1724, only to resume the throne within months after Louis died unexpectedly of smallpox. These episodes left considerable governing authority in the hands of his second wife, Elizabeth Farnese, and various ministers who learned to manage a monarch whose capacity for rule fluctuated unpredictably. Ferdinand VI, who succeeded his father in 1746, pursued a notably cautious foreign policy, keeping Spain out of the general European wars of the mid-18th century and focusing instead on internal administrative consolidation and naval rebuilding. His reign is generally remembered as a period of relative peace and steady, unspectacular improvement. Infrastructure projects, continued naval investment, and a census and cadastral survey, the Catastro de Ensenada, that gave the crown a far more accurate picture of Castile's population and resources than any previous Spanish government had possessed. Charles III, who came to the throne in 1759 after ruling Naples and Sicily for over 2 decades, brought the Bourbon reform project to its fullest expression. He arrived in Madrid with genuine administrative experience and a court of capable ministers, Aranda Floridablanca Campomanes, who shared an Enlightenment-influenced conviction that rational administration, agricultural improvement, and expanded trade could restore Spanish prosperity without requiring any fundamental challenge to royal absolutism or Catholic orthodoxy. This combination, absolutist politics paired with Enlightenment administrative technique, is often described by historians as enlightened despotism, and Charles III is usually considered its most capable Spanish practitioner. The expulsion of the Jesuits in 1767 was among the most consequential and controversial acts of Charles III's reign. The order had accumulated enormous wealth, extensive land holdings, and a degree of institutional independence, particularly visible in the Paraguayan reductions discussed earlier, that made them appear to Charles's ministers as a state within the state, answerable ultimately to Rome rather than to Madrid. Suspected involvement in urban riots in Madrid in 1766, though never definitively proven, provided the pretext. Jesuits were arrested simultaneously across Spain and its American territories in a single coordinated operation and shipped to the Papal States, their properties and considerable assets confiscated by the Crown. Free trade reform represented the other major pillar of Charles III's economic program, gradually dismantling the centuries-old monopoly that Seville and later Cadiz had held over American commerce. The Reglamento de Libre Comercio of 1778 opened trade between most major Spanish ports and most major American ports, ending the requirement that all colonial commerce pass through a single licensed port and fleet system. Trade volumes with the Americas increased substantially in the years that followed, though the reform came late enough in the century that it could not fully reverse decades of smuggling networks and foreign commercial penetration that had already become entrenched. The colonies themselves were reorganized administratively during this same period in ways that reflected Bourbon's centralizing instincts. New viceroyalties were created: New Granada in 1717, made permanent in 1739, and the Rio de la Plata in 1776, carving more manageable administrative units out of territories that the old two-viceroyalty system of New Spain and Peru had struggled to govern effectively across such enormous distances. Buenos Aires, previously a peripheral outpost of the Peruvian viceroyalty, became the seat of its own viceregal government almost overnight, a change that would matter enormously when independence movements emerged a few decades later. Revenue extraction from the colonies intensified considerably under the Bourbon reforms, and this is where the reforming project began generating exactly the kind of resentment that would eventually undermine it. New taxes, more efficient tax collection through the intendant system extended to the Americas, tighter royal control over previously semi-autonomous colonial institutions, and stricter enforcement of trade regulations all increased the flow of revenue back to Madrid. Colonial elites, particularly the American-born Spaniards known as Creoles, experienced these changes not as rational modernization, but as an escalating extraction that offered them less autonomy and less profit than the looser, more negligent administration of the previous Habsburg century had allowed. The Comunero Revolt in New Granada in 1781 and the much larger Tupac Amaru II rebellion in Peru that same year revealed how much strain the Bourbon reforms had placed on colonial society. Tupac Amaru II, a Cusco nobleman claiming descent from the last Inca rulers, led an uprising that drew in tens of thousands of indigenous and mestizo participants protesting the mita, new taxes, and abusive corregidores. The rebellion was crushed with extreme brutality. Tupac Amaru II was captured and executed in a manner designed to terrorize into submission anyone who might consider following his example. But the scale of the uprising demonstrated that Bourbon efficiency had generated colonial anger that ran far deeper than Madrid's ministers generally appreciated. By the time Charles III died in 1788, the Bourbon reforms had genuinely strengthened the Spanish state in measurable ways: a more professional administration, a rebuilt navy, expanded trade, and a treasury drawing more reliable revenue from its American territories than the Habsburg system had ever managed. What those same reforms had not achieved was the loyalty and contentment of the colonial elites, whose cooperation the whole imperial structure ultimately depended upon. Creoles across the Americas had watched their local privileges eroded, their commercial opportunities increasingly regulated, and their political voice diminished in favor of peninsular-born officials sent from Spain to enforce Madrid's tightening grip, a resentment that the coming crisis of the Napoleonic Wars would give them at last the opportunity to act upon. Chapter 12: The American World in the 18th Century. By the middle of the 18th century, the Spanish Empire had reached a geographic extent that even Philip II might have found difficult to fully picture. It stretched from the missions of California in the north to the silver mines of Potosí and the settlements of the Rio de la Plata in the south, from the Caribbean islands eastward to the Philippine archipelago on the far side of the Pacific. No single official, no single map, no single mind could hold the entire territory in view at once. What existed instead was a patchwork of regions, each shaped by its own economy, its own population, and its own relationship to the crown that claimed authority over all of them. California represented the newest and most tentative edge of that empire. Spanish settlement there began only in 1769, remarkably late given how long Spain had held the rest of the Pacific coast, driven largely by fear that Russian fur traders expanding south from Alaska might claim the territory first. Franciscan missionaries under Junipero Serra established a chain of missions running north from San Diego, each built roughly a day's journey from the next, designed to convert and settle indigenous populations while asserting Spanish sovereignty over land that had never before seen a permanent European presence. The mission system in California operated on a logic similar to the reducciones established 2 centuries earlier in Peru, concentrating dispersed indigenous populations into settlements organized around agricultural labor and religious instruction. Indigenous peoples who entered mission life, whether through persuasion, coercion, or the simple collapse of their previous subsistence patterns, as Spanish livestock and settlement disrupted local ecosystems, found themselves subject to strict discipline, high mortality from introduced disease, and labor regimes that priests justified as necessary for their spiritual salvation. The demographic toll across the mission period was severe, following a pattern the empire had repeated, with local variations since its earliest days in the Caribbean. At the opposite end of the empire's reach, Buenos Aires had spent most of the colonial period as a neglected backwater, administratively subordinate to the distant viceroyalty of Peru, and legally barred from most direct trade under the old Seville monopoly system. Its economic significance grew anyway, largely through contraband, smuggled goods moving through the Rio de la Plata estuary far more efficiently than legal trade routes running all the way around South America to Lima ever could. By the 1770s, the Crown finally acknowledged this reality rather than continuing to fight it. The creation of the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata in 1776 transformed Buenos Aires almost overnight from a peripheral smuggling port into the administrative center of a vast new jurisdiction covering modern Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia's silver-producing highlands. The city's population and commercial importance grew rapidly under its new status, and a local merchant and administrative class developed there with a confidence and independence of outlook that would prove significant decades later when the question of separating from Spain altogether finally came before them. Manila occupied a role in this imperial system unlike anywhere else Spain governed, functioning less as a settler colony than as a fortified trading post suspended at the far end of an extraordinarily long supply and communication chain. The city's Spanish population remained small throughout the colonial period, vastly outnumbered by Filipino residents and by a large Chinese merchant community, the Sanglis, whose commercial networks made the galleon trade with Acapulco possible in practice, even as Spanish law tried to regulate and restrict their numbers. Periodic massacres of the Chinese population, driven by settler anxiety about their economic dominance, punctuated Manila's history with a violence distinct from anything seen in the American colonies. The galleon trade itself continued to define Manila's economic purpose right through the 18th century, even as the ships involved grew larger and the profits, for those who survived the voyage, grew more extraordinary. A single galleon might carry cargo worth millions of pesos, and the arrival of the Manila galleon in Acapulco each year was a major commercial event that drew merchants from across New Spain to bid on Chinese silks, porcelain, and spices before those goods continued their journey overland toward Veracruz and onward to Spain. The Pacific crossing remained dangerous, and the loss of a single galleon to storm or enemy action represented a financial catastrophe felt as far away as Madrid. The Creole population, Americans of Spanish descent, born in the New World rather than in Iberia, had grown by the 18th century into the social and economic backbone of colonial society across most of Spanish America. Creoles owned the great haciendas and mines, dominated local commerce, filled the ranks of the lower clergy, and increasingly sought positions within colonial administration and the audiencias, the courts that governed provincial life. Yet the highest offices, the viceroyalties, and the senior bishoprics remained overwhelmingly reserved for peninsulares, Spaniards born in Iberia and sent across the Atlantic specifically to hold the reins of power that Madrid did not trust to men born on colonial soil. This distinction, peninsular against Creole, generated a resentment that deepened considerably over the 18th century as Bourbon reforms tightened royal oversight and increased the number of peninsular officials dispatched to enforce it. Creoles who considered themselves thoroughly loyal Spanish subjects, who shared the same language, the same faith, and often the same family lineage as the officials sent to govern them, found themselves treated as a lesser category of Spaniard, capable of managing their own estates, but apparently not trusted to manage a viceroyalty or preside over a bishopric. The insult accumulated across generations, and it accumulated specifically among the class of people who had the education, the wealth, and eventually the organizational capacity to act on it. Below the Creole elite sat an enormously complex racial and social hierarchy that Spanish colonial administrators had spent 2 centuries trying to formalize through the casta system, a set of categories describing every conceivable combination of Spanish, indigenous, and African ancestry. Mestizos, born of Spanish and indigenous parentage, occupied an intermediate status that varied considerably by region and by individual circumstance. Mulattoes, of Spanish and African descent, and a wide range of further subcategories with their own names and their own accumulated legal and social implications, filled out a taxonomy that colonial society took seriously on paper, even as everyday practice was considerably messier and more fluid than the formal categories suggested. Enslaved Africans and their descendants formed an essential part of the colonial economy in specific regions, particularly the Caribbean, the Pacific coast of New Granada, and parts of coastal Peru and Venezuela, where plantation agriculture and mining required labor forces that indigenous populations, decimated by disease and confined largely to the highlands, could no longer supply. The scale of slavery in Spanish America never matched the plantation economies that would develop in Portuguese Brazil or the British and French Caribbean, but it was substantial in the regions where it existed, and free communities of African descent, some formed through manumission, others through escape and independent settlement known as palenques or quilombos, existed alongside the plantation system throughout the period. Indigenous communities, though reduced dramatically from their pre-conquest numbers, remained the demographic majority across large portions of the empire, particularly in the densely populated highland regions of Mesoamerica and the Andes. Many of these communities had developed, over 2 centuries of colonial rule, a working relationship with the Spanish legal and religious system that allowed them to preserve elements of communal landholding, local governance, and cultural practice, even while nominally integrated into the colonial order. This relationship was never equal and never fully secure, subject to periodic land encroachment and labor demands that could escalate without warning, as the Tupac Amaru II rebellion in Peru had demonstrated only a few years before the century's end. Trade and commerce in this 18th century empire had grown considerably more complex than the simple civil monopoly of the previous 2 centuries had ever accommodated. The free trade reforms of 1778 had opened numerous ports on both sides of the Atlantic to direct commerce, and colonial merchants in Buenos Aires, Havana, Cartagena, and Veracruz built commercial networks that operated with considerably more autonomy from Madrid's direct oversight than their predecessors a century earlier had enjoyed. Contraband trade with British, French, and Dutch merchants continued alongside the legal system regardless of these reforms, since colonial demand for manufactured goods routinely outpaced what Spain's own industries could supply. Education and intellectual life had also developed considerably by this point, producing a colonial elite increasingly exposed to Enlightenment ideas circulating from France and elsewhere in Europe, even as the Inquisition nominally continued to police the importation of prohibited books. Universities in Mexico City, Lima, and other major colonial centers had been training lawyers, theologians, and administrators for generations, and a growing print culture, however censored, carried European philosophical and scientific currents into colonial intellectual circles. Creole scholars in this period began articulating, in scholarly and literary work, a distinct American identity, proud of pre-Columbian civilizations, proud of American natural abundance, and increasingly less inclined to view Spain itself as the unquestioned center of their civilizational world. By the 1780s and into the 1790s, the Spanish-American world had become, in nearly every meaningful sense, a society capable of governing itself. It had its own economic elites, its own administrative experience accumulated over generations within the audiencias and municipal councils, its own intellectual culture increasingly engaged with ideas of natural rights and self-determination, and its own deepening sense of grievance against a peninsular authority that seemed to demand ever more revenue while offering ever less genuine partnership in return. What this world still lacked in the final years of the 18th century was the specific crisis that would finally break the political bond holding it to Madrid. That crisis was already gathering in Europe, in the ambitions of a French general who had not yet crowned himself emperor, and it would arrive within Spain's own royal family sooner than anyone in either Madrid or the American colonies expected. Chapter 13: Napoleon and the Unraveling. By the first years of the 19th century, the Spanish crown had entangled itself so deeply with Napoleonic France that its own sovereignty had become little more than a formality. Charles IV, who had succeeded his father Charles III in 1788, was a monarch of limited ability and even more limited interest in governance, content to leave the actual business of ruling to his chief minister, Manuel Godoy. Godoy had risen from a minor position in the royal guard to become the most powerful man in Spain, largely through the Queen's favor, and his foreign policy through the 1790s and early 1800s bent Spain increasingly into France's orbit, first through fear of revolutionary contagion and later through simple subordination to Napoleon's expanding continental system. The naval disaster at Trafalgar in October 1805 exposed just how costly this French alliance had already become. A combined Franco-Spanish fleet under Admiral Villeneuve was destroyed by Nelson's Royal Navy off the coast of Cadiz, a defeat that effectively ended Spain's capacity to project naval power or defend its own colonial shipping lanes for the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars. Spanish ships, Spanish sailors, and Spanish treasure had been committed to a French strategic gamble that failed catastrophically, and Spain would spend the rest of the conflict paying for that failure without ever having chosen it independently. Napoleon's ambitions toward Spain sharpened considerably by 1807, when he negotiated the Treaty of Fontainebleau with Godoy's government, ostensibly to arrange a joint Franco-Spanish conquest and partition of Portugal. The treaty allowed French troops passage through Spanish territory, and those troops kept coming in numbers that made clear Napoleon's actual intentions extended well beyond Portugal. By early 1808, French forces occupied major Spanish fortresses and cities under the guise of an allied army, while Napoleon's real plan, replacing the Spanish Bourbons entirely with a monarch of his own choosing, took shape behind the diplomatic language of alliance. Popular anger at Godoy and at the growing French presence exploded in March 1808 at Aranjuez, where a riot forced Charles IV to dismiss his minister and abdicate in favor of his son, who took the throne as Ferdinand VII. Napoleon, seeing an opportunity in the chaos, summoned both father and son to Bayonne in France under the pretense of mediating their dispute. Once there, he pressured both men into renouncing their claims to the Spanish throne entirely, and in May 1808 he installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain, a coup executed almost entirely through diplomatic maneuvering rather than open war, at least in its opening act. Spain did not accept this arrangement quietly. On May 2, 1808, the people of Madrid rose against French troops in the streets. A spontaneous uprising crushed brutally the following day when French forces executed captured rebels by firing squad, a scene later immortalized by the painter Francisco Goya. The uprising in Madrid was suppressed within hours, but it ignited a much broader popular resistance across Spain that no single battle could extinguish, since it drew not from any organized army, but from ordinary Spaniards who regarded a Bonaparte on the Spanish throne as an unacceptable foreign imposition. The Peninsular War that followed, lasting from 1808 until 1814, combined conventional military campaigns with a form of irregular resistance that gave the very word guerrilla little war to the English language. Spanish civilians organized ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run raids against French supply lines and isolated garrisons across the countryside, tying down hundreds of thousands of French troops in an occupation that never achieved genuine control despite repeated military victories in open battle. British forces under Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal in 1808 and fought alongside Spanish and Portuguese forces for years, slowly grinding down the French position through a combination of set-piece battles and a scorched earth strategy that denied Napoleon's armies the resources they needed to sustain themselves. While the war against French occupation continued, Spain's political structure fractured in ways that would prove just as significant as the military campaign itself. With the legitimate king a prisoner in France and Joseph Bonaparte controlling much of the country from Madrid, local juntas, governing councils organized by provincial elites claiming to rule in Ferdinand VII's name during his captivity, sprang up across unoccupied Spain. These juntas eventually coordinated into a supreme central junta, and when that body proved unwieldy, into a council of regency that called for the election of a national assembly to govern Spain, and crucially its American territories, in the king's absence. That assembly, the Cortes of Cádiz, convened in 1810 in one of the few Spanish cities that French forces never managed to capture, protected by British naval power and Cádiz's defensible geography. The delegates who gathered there, representing both peninsular Spain and, in a genuinely significant innovation, appointed representatives from the American colonies, undertook the task of writing a constitution for a nation whose legitimate king remained a prisoner in France and whose capital remained under enemy occupation. It was an extraordinary act of political improvisation conducted under siege conditions by men uncertain whether the country they were legislating for would even survive as an independent state. The Constitution of 1812, promulgated in March of that year, was a document of genuine liberal ambition, establishing a constitutional monarchy with sovereignty vested in the nation rather than the crown, a single-chamber legislature, freedom of the press within limits, and the abolition of many of the legal privileges that had defined the old aristocratic and clerical order. It also, at least on paper, extended citizenship and representation to Spain's American territories on more equal terms than the colonial system had ever previously offered, though the practical application of this equality proved far more limited than its written promise, particularly regarding the status of indigenous and mixed-race populations across the empire. Ferdinand VII's eventual restoration in 1814, once Napoleon's broader European position had collapsed and the French agreed to release him, brought none of the constitutional promise to fruition. Ferdinand returned to Spain and, within weeks, repudiated the Constitution of 1812 entirely, restored absolute monarchy, and began arresting the very liberal reformers who had spent years governing in his name during his captivity. The King's Spain had fought a 6-year war to restore proved, once restored, to be a ruler with no interest whatsoever in the political principles that resistance to Napoleon had, for many of his subjects, come to represent. Across the Atlantic, the consequences of these years in Spain played out with even greater force, because the crisis in Madrid had removed, almost overnight, the central authority that had held the American colonial system together for 3 centuries. When news reached the Americas in 1808 that the legitimate king had been deposed and a French usurper installed in his place, colonial officials and Creole elites faced a genuinely unprecedented question. To whom did their loyalty now belong, and under what authority did the existing colonial government continue to claim legitimacy at all? The answer varied by region, but a common pattern emerged across much of Spanish America between 1808 and 1810. Local juntas formed, similar in structure to those appearing in unoccupied Spain, claiming to govern in Ferdinand VII's name during his captivity, while colonial authorities loyal to the old order and Creole reformers eager for greater autonomy contested control of these new bodies. In some cities, like Buenos Aires and Caracas, these juntas moved quickly toward positions that amounted to functional self-government, even while maintaining the formal fiction of loyalty to an absent king. The Cortes of Cadiz had attempted to address American grievances by extending representation and citizenship to the colonies, but the gesture arrived too late and too partially to satisfy elites who had already begun, in practice, to govern themselves during the years of Spain's paralysis. American representatives at Cadiz found their numbers and their influence limited relative to peninsular delegates, and many of the specific reforms they sought, greater local autonomy, expanded trade rights, reduced tribute burdens on indigenous populations, were debated without ever being fully implemented before Ferdinand's restoration swept the entire constitutional experiment away. Ferdinand's return to absolutism in 1814 removed any remaining possibility that Spain might satisfy American aspirations for greater self-governance through negotiated reform within the imperial system. Colonial elites who had spent years operating juntas with real administrative authority were now expected to submit once again to an absolutist crown that showed no interest in the constitutional principles many of them had come to value, and no willingness to extend the equal partnership the Cadiz Cortes had briefly promised. The gap between what American Spaniards had experienced during Spain's crisis and what Ferdinand now demanded of them had become for many simply too wide to close. What Napoleon had done in deposing the Spanish crown to install his own brother was inadvertently dismantle the single mechanism that had held a fractured 3-century colonial system together across an ocean and 4 continents, the person of a legitimate king whose authority nobody seriously questioned. Once that authority had been shown capable of collapsing in a matter of weeks, replaced by a foreign puppet, restored years later by a monarch who honored none of the promises made in his name, the idea that American Spaniards owed permanent, unconditional loyalty to Madrid no longer held the force it once had. The vacuum Napoleon created in 1808 would not be filled again by Spanish royal authority. It would be filled in the years that followed by men who had learned during the crisis that they were capable of governing themselves. Chapter 14: Independence. The wars that ended Spanish rule in the Americas did not begin as wars for independence. They began almost everywhere as movements claiming loyalty to the imprisoned Ferdinand VII, organized by juntas insisting they were merely safeguarding the colonies until legitimate royal authority could be restored. That fiction held for a few years in most places. It did not survive contact with the deeper grievances: Creole resentment, economic frustration, and a growing conviction that self-government was both possible and preferable, that the crisis in Spain had finally given room to breathe. Miguel Hidalgo's uprising in New Spain broke from this pattern earlier and more violently than most. A parish priest in the town of Dolores, Hidalgo issued his call to rebellion in September 1810, the Grito de Dolores, summoning a largely indigenous and mestizo following to rise against Spanish rule with a mixture of religious and political appeals to social justice, not merely elite grievance about representation. His movement grew rapidly into an army of tens of thousands, marched on Mexico City, and then, in a decision historians still debate, turned back before taking the capital, a choice that gave royalist forces time to regroup. Hidalgo was captured and executed in 1811, and command of the insurgency passed to another priest, José María Morelos, who proved a considerably more disciplined military and political organizer. Morelos convened a congress at Chilpancingo in 1813 that formally declared Mexican independence and articulated a program calling for the abolition of slavery and the racial caste system that had structured colonial society for 3 centuries. Royalist forces captured and executed Morelos in 1815, and the movement he had led fragmented into smaller guerrilla bands that persisted without achieving decisive victory for several more years. Mexican independence, when it finally arrived in 1821, came through an alliance that would have seemed unthinkable a decade earlier. Agustín de Iturbide, a royalist officer who had spent years fighting the insurgency, switched sides and negotiated the Plan of Iguala with the remaining rebel forces, uniting royalists uneasy about Ferdinand VII's restored absolutism with insurgents exhausted by over a decade of war. The plan guaranteed independence, Catholic religious exclusivity, and formal equality between peninsulares and Creoles, and it succeeded where a decade of Hidalgo and Morelos's more radical insurgency had not, precisely because it offered conservative elites a path to independence that threatened the existing social order far less severely. In South America, the independence movement produced 2 towering military figures whose campaigns eventually converged from opposite directions. Simón Bolívar, born into a wealthy Creole family in Caracas, began his military career in the Venezuelan independence struggle after early setbacks nearly ended the movement entirely, and he spent the 1810s building both an army and a political vision he called Gran Colombia, a proposed union of the territories that would become Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. His campaigns were marked by extraordinary feats of endurance, including the crossing of the flooded plains and freezing Andean passes before the decisive victory at Boyacá in 1819 that secured Colombian independence. José de San Martín approached the same broad struggle from the south, with a temperament and strategy considerably different from Bolívar's. San Martín had served in the Spanish army in Europe before returning to Argentina, and rather than fighting a purely Argentine war, he conceived of Spanish-American independence as a continental project requiring the liberation of Chile and Peru as well, since royalist strongholds anywhere on the continent threatened the security of newly independent republics elsewhere. His crossing of the Andes in 1817 with an army of several thousand men, artillery and all, over passes above 12,000 feet, ranks among the most audacious military operations of the entire era, comparable in ambition to Hannibal's crossing of the Alps. San Martin liberated Chile after victories at Chacabuco in 1817 and Maipú in 1818, then turned north toward Peru, the last major royalist stronghold and the historic seat of Spanish colonial power in South America. He entered Lima in 1821 and declared Peruvian independence, but the royalist army remained intact in the interior highlands, and San Martin lacked the military strength to finish the campaign alone. The famous meeting between San Martin and Bolívar at Guayaquil in July 1822 remains one of the great unresolved mysteries of the independence era. No reliable record survives of what was actually discussed, but San Martin withdrew from the struggle entirely afterward, leaving Bolívar to complete the liberation of Peru without him. Bolívar's final campaigns in Peru, conducted alongside his most capable lieutenant, Antonio José de Sucre, brought the war to its decisive conclusion. Sucre's victory at the Battle of Ayacucho in December 1824 destroyed the last major royalist army in South America and effectively ended Spanish colonial rule on the continent, save for a few isolated garrisons that held out briefly afterward without any realistic hope of reversing the outcome. Upper Peru, liberated in the campaign's aftermath, was renamed Bolivia in Bolívar's honor, a rare tribute paid to a leader still very much alive to witness it. Why the empire collapsed so completely and so quickly once the fighting truly began is a question that requires looking past the individual battles to the structural weaknesses that Spain had accumulated over the previous century. Military overstretch was severe and immediate. Spain, having just fought a devastating 6-year war against Napoleonic occupation, had neither the treasury nor the manpower to simultaneously suppress rebellions spanning an entire hemisphere. Troops sent to the Americas arrived in insufficient numbers, poorly supplied, and often demoralized by a war they increasingly understood as unwinnable. Creole grievance, accumulated across the Bourbon century of tightening fiscal extraction and diminished local autonomy, provided the essential social foundation without which no purely military campaign could have sustained itself for over a decade. The men who financed, organized, and led the independence armies were overwhelmingly drawn from the same Creole elite that had spent generations watching peninsular officials monopolize the highest offices and profits of colonial administration. Once that elite decided the cost of continued Spanish rule exceeded its benefits, the empire had lost the domestic collaborators on whom its entire administrative structure had always depended. The Napoleonic disruption, examined in the previous chapter, supplied the specific trigger that turned long-simmering resentment into open rebellion, removing the legitimate king, installing a foreign usurper, and then restoring an absolutist monarch who honored none of the constitutional promises made during the crisis destroyed, in the span of a single decade, the ideological foundation on which 3 centuries of colonial loyalty had rested. American Spaniards had governed themselves through the juntas during Ferdinand's captivity, discovered they were capable of doing so, and found no compelling reason to surrender that capacity once Spain's political chaos had passed. Enlightenment republicanism, absorbed by Creole elites through decades of exposure to French and American revolutionary ideas, despite the Inquisition's formal efforts at censorship, provided the intellectual vocabulary through which independence leaders articulated their cause. Bolivar himself had traveled in Europe and had been deeply influenced by Enlightenment political philosophy, and his writings, particularly the Jamaica Letter of 1815, framed Spanish-American independence not merely as a regional grievance, but as part of a broader historical movement toward popular sovereignty and self-determination that the American and French revolutions had already set in motion elsewhere. The wars themselves were extraordinarily destructive, and their costs fell disproportionately on the populations least responsible for starting them. 15 years of continuous warfare across a continent devastated agricultural production, disrupted mining operations that had sustained colonial economies for centuries, and killed enormous numbers of soldiers and civilians on both sides of every conflict. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Armies conscripted or coerced participation from populations with little stake in the outcome, and the economic infrastructure that would eventually need to support newly independent nations emerged from the wars badly damaged rather than ready for immediate prosperity. What replaced Spanish colonial rule was not, in most cases, the stable constitutional order that independence leaders had envisioned while fighting for it. Bolivar's dream of Gran Colombia fractured within years of achieving independence, splitting into Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador as regional rivalries proved stronger than continental unity. Similar fragmentation occurred across the former Spanish territories generally, as the vast administrative units the Bourbon crown had constructed proved difficult to hold together as unified nations once the external pressure of Spanish rule, which had at least provided a common adversary, had been removed. By 1826, Spain retained almost nothing of the American empire that had defined its global position for over 3 centuries. Cuba and Puerto Rico remained loyal, for reasons rooted in their particular colonial economies and demographic structures that differed significantly from the mainland territories, and the Philippines remained under Spanish control on the far side of the Pacific. Everything else, the viceroyalties of New Spain, Peru, New Granada, and the Rio de la Plata, encompassing territory that had taken conquistadors decades to subdue in the 16th century, was gone, lost in a span of roughly 15 years to a rebellion that had begun, in most places, as a movement claiming loyalty to the very crown it eventually overthrew. The speed of that collapse remains one of the most striking features of the entire episode. An empire that had survived the loss of the Netherlands, the loss of Portugal, repeated bankruptcies, and centuries of European wars fought on multiple continents simultaneously, unraveled across its American core within the span of a single generation once the specific combination of military exhaustion, Creole alienation, and ideological transformation reached its breaking point. Ferdinand VII, restored to his throne in Madrid in 1814, with every intention of ruling as though nothing had changed, would spend the final years of his reign discovering that the empire he had inherited no longer existed in the form his ancestors had built it, and that what remained of it, a scattering of island colonies in the Caribbean and the Pacific, was all that would carry the Spanish crown into its final imperial century. Chapter 15, Cuba, 1898, and the long aftermath. By the final decades of the 19th century, Spain's American empire had shrunk to a handful of Caribbean possessions and a distant Pacific archipelago, the last fragments of a territory that had once stretched across 4 continents. Cuba was by far the most valuable of what remained. Its sugar plantations, worked historically through enslaved African labor and increasingly through a mixture of free and indentured workers as abolition progressed slowly across the century, generated enormous wealth for Spanish and Cuban planters alike, and Madrid regarded the island as an indispensable possession rather than a mere colonial afterthought. Puerto Rico, smaller and less economically dominant than Cuba, followed a broadly similar colonial arc, its plantation economy and Spanish administrative structure enduring with fewer of the dramatic upheavals that would eventually convulse its larger neighbor. The Philippines, on the far side of the world, remained under Spanish rule through a colonial administration built around Catholic missionary orders that had by this point held religious and administrative authority over the archipelago for over 3 centuries. All 3 territories shared a common feature by the 1860s and 1870s, a growing population of educated, often wealthy local elites who had begun to question with increasing openness whether Spanish rule still served their genuine interests. Cuba's first serious independence war, the 10 Years' War, broke out in 1868 and revealed just how deep the fractures within Cuban society had already become. Landowners in the eastern part of the island, less economically tied to Spain than the wealthier planters around Havana, launched a rebellion under Carlos Manuel de Céspedes that combined demands for independence with, in its early phases, calls for the abolition of slavery. The war dragged on inconclusively for a decade, exhausting both Spanish military resources and Cuban rebel capacity, before ending in 1878 with the Pact of Zanjón, a settlement that granted limited reforms without addressing the underlying question of independence at all. The peace that followed proved fragile and temporary. Cuban nationalism, rather than fading after the 10 Years' War, matured over the following 2 decades into a more organized and more broadly supported movement, shaped significantly by exile communities in the United States who provided funding, arms, and political coordination for a renewed struggle. José Martí, a poet, journalist, and tireless organizer who had spent years in exile after his own imprisonment as a teenager during the earlier war, became the movement's most important political and intellectual leader, founding the Cuban Revolutionary Party in 1892, specifically to prepare for a new and, this time, decisive war of independence. That war began in February 1895, coordinated to erupt simultaneously in multiple parts of the island, and Martí himself returned from exile to join the fighting only to be killed within weeks, in May 1895, in one of his first engagements. His death did not end the movement he had built. Command passed to military leaders including Máximo Gómez and Antonio Maceo, veterans of the earlier conflict who understood Cuban terrain and guerrilla tactics well enough to sustain a punishing campaign against a much larger Spanish garrison force sent to crush the rebellion. Spain's response, under the command of General Valeriano Weyler, introduced a policy that shocked international opinion and generated the humanitarian catastrophe that would eventually draw the United States directly into the conflict. Weyler ordered the Reconquista policy in 1896, forcibly relocating rural Cuban civilians into fortified towns and camps in order to deny the guerrilla insurgency the food, shelter, and local support it depended upon in the countryside. The policy achieved its narrow military objective at horrific human cost, as disease and starvation in the overcrowded camps killed tens of thousands of Cuban civilians who had no direct involvement in the fighting. American public opinion, already sympathetic to the Cuban independence cause through years of exile lobbying and extensive newspaper coverage, turned decisively against Spain as reports and often exaggerated illustrations of the Reconquista camps filled American newspapers. The sensationalist press competition between William Randolph Hearst's and Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper empires amplified these accounts considerably, a phenomenon later remembered as yellow journalism, though the underlying humanitarian crisis in the camps was genuine regardless of how dramatically it was reported to American readers. The immediate trigger for American military intervention arrived in February 1898, when the USS Maine, an American battleship anchored in Havana Harbor, ostensibly to protect American citizens and property during the unrest, exploded and sank, killing 266 sailors. The cause of the explosion remains disputed even by modern forensic analysis, with theories ranging from an external mine to an internal accident involving the ship's coal bunkers. But American public opinion at the time overwhelmingly assumed Spanish sabotage, and the rallying cry "Remember the Maine" became the emotional catalyst for a war that Congress formally declared in April 1898. The Spanish-American War itself lasted only a few months and demonstrated with brutal clarity just how far Spanish military power had fallen behind that of a rising industrial power like the United States. American naval forces under Commodore George Dewey destroyed the Spanish Pacific Fleet at Manila Bay in May 1898 in a battle that lasted only a few hours and resulted in negligible American casualties against a comprehensively outmatched Spanish squadron. Spanish naval forces in the Caribbean fared no better, suffering a similarly one-sided defeat at the Battle of Santiago de Cuba in July, effectively ending any Spanish capacity to contest American control of the surrounding waters. American land forces, including the Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, popularly known as the Rough Riders under Theodore Roosevelt, landed in Cuba and fought alongside Cuban insurgent forces in a campaign that, while militarily significant, has often overshadowed the years of Cuban fighting and sacrifice that had already brought Spanish colonial authority to the brink of collapse before American troops ever arrived. Santiago de Cuba surrendered to American forces in July 1898, and Spanish resistance across the island collapsed within weeks, bringing active combat operations to an end after a war that had lasted barely 4 months from its formal declaration. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, formalized Spain's total loss of its remaining American and Pacific empire in terms that left little room for Spanish negotiating leverage. Spain relinquished all claim to Cuba, though the island's independence would prove considerably more constrained than Cuban nationalists had fought for, given the terms of the Platt Amendment that the United States subsequently imposed on the new Cuban Constitution. Puerto Rico and Guam were ceded outright to the United States, and the Philippines were sold to American control for $20 million, a transaction that ignited a separate and bloody Philippine-American War as Filipino nationalists, who had been fighting Spain for their own independence, found themselves instead fighting a new colonial occupier. The losses of 1898 landed on Spain with a psychological force that went well beyond their strategic significance, since by that point the American colonies represented only a fraction of what the empire had once encompassed. Spanish intellectuals of the period, a group later known collectively as the Generation of '98, responded to the disaster with an extended period of national soul-searching, producing literature and political commentary that grappled openly with questions of Spanish identity, decline, and modernization in ways that shaped Spanish cultural and intellectual life well into the 20th century. The empire that had once stretched across the globe had been reduced, within the span of a single year, to a scattering of territories in Africa and a national memory of what had been lost. What the empire left behind, across the vast territories where it had once ruled, proved far more durable than the political structure itself. The Spanish language became the dominant tongue of a majority of nations across 2 continents, spoken today by hundreds of millions of people from the American Southwest to the southern tip of Chile. Catholic institutions, legal traditions rooted in Spanish colonial law, city plans built around the same central plaza and grid pattern imposed by 16th-century town planning ordinances, and architectural styles carried across the Atlantic centuries earlier, all persisted long after the political authority that had introduced them had vanished from the map entirely. The demographic and cultural legacy of the empire was, and remains, deeply contested and often painful to reckon with honestly. The mixing of Spanish, indigenous, and African peoples across the Americas produced the mestizo and Creole societies that define Latin American identity today. But that mixing emerged from centuries of conquest, forced labor, and demographic catastrophe that killed indigenous populations on a scale historians still struggle to fully quantify. National borders across Latin America, in many cases, still trace lines first drawn by Spanish viceregal administration centuries ago, and legal disputes, cultural tensions, and questions of indigenous rights rooted in that colonial history continue to shape political life across the region well into the present day. Spain itself, stripped of its American and Pacific empire by the end of 1898, retained only scattered territories in North Africa, and entered the 20th century as a diminished European power, grappling with the same questions of modernization, industrialization, and political stability that had bedeviled it, in various forms, for the better part of 2 centuries. The nation that had once commanded the resources of Potosí governed viceroyalties spanning entire continents, and dispatched conquistadors and missionaries to territories no European had previously known existed, now faced the more modest task of governing itself as a single, unified, considerably smaller nation on the Iberian Peninsula, where its story as a global empire had first begun 400 years earlier. The 4 centuries between Ferdinand and Isabella's marriage in 1469 and the surrender at Santiago de Cuba in 1898 had produced an empire of contradictions that no single verdict can adequately summarize. It had spread Catholic faith and Spanish language across a hemisphere while destroying through disease and forced labor tens of millions of the people it claimed to be saving. It had built cities, universities, and legal institutions that still function today, while extracting wealth through systems of exploitation whose consequences persist in the economic and social inequalities still visible across Latin America. It had produced serious theological arguments about universal human dignity, even as its economic foundation depended on denying that dignity to millions of people in practice. What remained, once the ships stopped sailing and the last colonial garrison lowered its flag, was not a simple legacy of glory or of shame, but the vast, unresolved inheritance of everything an empire that size inevitably leaves behind.